Welcome, fellow citizens of South Park, to the shadows that lurk beneath Colorado's most notorious mountain town. Tonight, we venture beyond the crude humor and satirical surface to explore the genuinely disturbing undercurrents that have defined 27 seasons of uncompromising storytelling. Here lie the moments that crossed every line, challenged every boundary, and revealed the darkest aspects of human nature through the lens of animated absurdity. So settle beneath your blankets, let the mountain darkness embrace your thoughts, and prepare to drift as we examine the most genuinely unsettling moments in South Park's legacy. Close your eyes, brave watchers, and let's descend. In the deceptively simple corridors of South Park Elementary School, where brightly colored lockers and cheerful bulletin boards create an illusion of childhood sanctuary, there exists a systematic process of innocence, destruction, so methodical and pervasive that it transcends mere educational dysfunction to encompass something far more sinister and profound about the nature of childhood itself within American society. The transformation of elementary school students from naive believers in adult competence and moral authority into cynical survivors who navigate complex ethical landscapes without reliable guidance reveals patterns of institutional failure so complete and consistent that they suggest deliberate cultivation of childhood trauma rather than accidental neglect or educational incompetence that might be addressed through policy reform or administrative restructuring. The Photoshop incident that devastated Wendy Testerberger represents more than simple peer pressure or social media influence, but rather the systematic demolition of moral conviction. When confronted with social conformity pressures that operate according to principles so ruthless and unforgiving that even the most principled individuals eventually surrender their ethical foundations rather than face continued isolation and ridicule from communities that reward deception over authenticity while punishing integrity through systematic exclusion and psychological manipulation. Wendy's tears as she digitally altered her appearance reflected not personal weakness or shallow vanity, but rather the inevitable collapse of individual moral resistance when subjected to social pressures that make ethical behavior psychologically unsustainable, while offering immediate relief through moral compromise that provides temporary social acceptance at the cost of permanent damage to personal integrity and authentic self-understanding. The educational environment that enables such systematic destruction of childhood innocence operates according to administrative principles that prioritize institutional reputation and regulatory compliance over genuine student welfare, while creating conditions where children must develop psychological defense mechanisms and survival strategies that should be unnecessary within protective educational frameworks designed to nurture development rather than accelerate the loss of childhood wonder and trust in adult authority. The recurring failure of teachers and administrators to recognize obvious signs of student distress or to provide appropriate intervention during crisis situations indicates either criminal negligence in professional responsibility, deliberate cultivation of educational environments where children learn to rely exclusively upon peer support systems while developing mistrust of adult guidance that will characterize their approach to authority relationships throughout their lives. The normalization of extreme situations within South Park Elementary's daily operations reveals systematic exposure of children to psychological stresses and moral complexity that exceed developmental capacity while forcing premature confrontation with ethical dilemmas that require sophisticated moral reasoning and emotional maturity that most adults struggle to navigate effectively, creating conditions where elementary school students must develop philosophical frameworks and decision-making capabilities that enable them to function in environments where normal childhood protection systems have completely failed, while adult supervision remains either absent or actively counterproductive to student welfare and psychological development. The pattern of adult incompetence that characterizes every institutional response to childhood crisis creates educational conditions where students must assume responsibility for problems that originate from systemic failures in adult leadership, while developing practical skills and emotional resilience that compensate for the absence of reliable adult protection and guidance. During situations that would challenge mature individuals with extensive life experience and professional training in crisis management and psychological support systems, the children's remarkable effectiveness in addressing complex problems that overwhelm their teachers and parents indicates not natural superiority or advanced development, but rather desperate adaptation to circumstances that require survival skills and autonomous decision-making capabilities that should be completely unnecessary within functional, educational, and family support systems. The psychological trauma that results from systematic exposure to adult inadequacy during childhood developmental phases creates lasting damage to fundamental trust relationships and authority recognition systems, while establishing behavioral patterns and emotional defense mechanisms that will influence adult relationship formation and professional interaction styles in ways that perpetuate cycles of institutional dysfunction and interpersonal mistrust across generational boundaries. The children's casual acceptance of extraordinary circumstances and their matter-of-fact approach to handling life-threatening situations reflects psychological adaptation mechanisms that enable functional behavior despite ongoing trauma exposure, while preventing the development of normal emotional processing systems and stress response patterns that would enable healthy adult relationships and stable family formation. The academic curriculum that fails to address the actual challenges students face while continuing to emphasize conventional educational objectives that bear no relationship to the practical skills and psychological capabilities they need to survive their daily experiences creates disconnection between institutional educational goals and student developmental needs that undermines the credibility of formal education, while forcing children to acquire essential knowledge and capabilities through unofficial channels that operate outside adult oversight or quality control systems. The irrelevance of traditional academic subjects when compared to the complex moral reasoning and crisis management skills that students must develop through direct experience indicates fundamental misalignment between educational theory and practical reality that renders formal schooling increasingly meaningless, while children develop genuine competencies through unstructured exploration of ethical and practical challenges. The social dynamics that emerge among students who must function without reliable adult support create peer relationship systems that assume responsibilities normally distributed across family and institutional authority structures, while developing collaborative problem-solving approaches and mutual support networks that compensate for the absence of functional adult guidance during critical developmental phases when children should be learning to trust and cooperate with legitimate authority figures rather than developing autonomous systems that exclude adult participation and oversight. The effectiveness of student-initiated solutions to complex problems that confound adult authorities demonstrates remarkable collaborative capabilities, while revealing the tragic necessity of premature independence from family and institutional support systems that should provide protective frameworks for gradual development rather than forcing immediate autonomy through crisis exposure. The moral development that occurs under conditions of systematic adult failure creates ethical reasoning capabilities that operate independently of conventional moral authority structures, while incorporating direct experience with complex consequences and competing value systems that enable sophisticated decision-making processes. Despite the absence of reliable moral guidance from family and educational institutions that should provide stable ethical frameworks during crucial identity formation phases of psychological development, the children's ability to navigate moral complexity that defeats adult reasoning indicates either extraordinary natural moral intuition or psychological adaptation that enables effective ethical decision-making despite the absence of consistent moral instruction or positive role modeling from authority figures who should serve as ethical guides and moral examples. The emotional resilience that characterizes childhood response to systematic trauma and institutional failure reflects psychological adaptation mechanisms that enable continued functioning despite ongoing exposure to stresses that would overwhelm most adults, while creating internal, emotional, processing systems that operate independently of external support networks that should provide comfort and guidance during difficult experiences, but instead contribute additional stress and confusion through inconsistent responses and inadequate protective measures that leave children emotionally isolated during crucial developmental phases, when psychological security should be establishing foundations for lifelong emotional stability and interpersonal trust. The creative problem-solving abilities that emerge from necessity when children must address complex challenges without adult assistance demonstrate remarkable intellectual flexibility and innovative thinking capabilities, while revealing the tragic waste of human potential that occurs when educational systems fail to recognize and nurture natural abilities that develop despite rather than because of institutional educational approaches that emphasize conformity and standardized responses over creative thinking and adaptive, problem-solving skills that enable effective navigation of unpredictable circumstances and novel challenges. The leadership patterns that develop among peer groups facing adult institutional failure create organizational structures and decision-making processes that reflect natural social intelligence while incorporating collaborative approaches that distribute responsibility and authority according to individual capabilities and situational demands, rather than arbitrary hierarchical systems that characterize adult institutional structures, where authority and competence often remain disconnected while creating administrative barriers to effective problem-solving and responsive decision-making during crisis situations that require immediate action and flexible adaptation. The communication systems that students develop to coordinate responses to complex challenges demonstrate sophisticated information sharing and strategic planning capabilities while operating through informal networks that maintain security and efficiency. Despite the absence of institutional support systems that should facilitate effective communication and coordination during emergency situations, but instead create bureaucratic obstacles and information delays that prevent timely responses to developing problems while contributing additional confusion and administrative complications that hinder rather than support effective crisis management. The psychological compartmentalization that enables children to maintain academic performance and social relationships despite ongoing trauma exposure reflects defense mechanisms that prevent complete psychological breakdown while creating internal emotional isolation that protects core identity and personality development from being overwhelmed by environmental stresses that exceed processing capacity. Though such defensive adaptations often create lasting barriers to authentic emotional expression and intimate relationship formation that will influence adult interpersonal relationships and family development patterns throughout their lives. The cynical worldview that emerges from repeated exposure to adult institutional failure and moral inconsistency creates philosophical frameworks that assume deception and incompetence as baseline expectations, while developing skeptical evaluation processes that protect against disappointment and exploitation through systematic mistrust of authority claims and institutional promises that have proven unreliable through direct experience with administrative failures and ethical violations that demonstrate the gap between official, institutional values and actual operational practices that prioritize administrative convenience over genuine service and protection. The survival instincts that develop through necessity when protective systems fail create psychological and behavioral adaptations that enable continued functioning in hostile or unpredictable environments while establishing patterns of hypervigilance and autonomous problem solving that may prove counterproductive in safer environments where trust and cooperation with authority figures could provide more effective solutions than the independent strategies that become necessary when institutional support systems remain absent or actively harmful to student welfare and developmental needs. The recognition patterns that enable rapid assessment of adult competence and reliability reflect accelerated social intelligence development that would be unnecessary in functional family and educational environments while creating sophisticated evaluation systems that distinguish between genuine authority and superficial credentials through direct observation of behavioral consistency and practical effectiveness, rather than accepting official designations or social status markers that may misrepresent actual capabilities and trustworthiness of individuals in positions of responsibility and authority. The ultimate tragedy of systematic childhood innocence destruction lies not in any specific incident or institutional failure, but in the complete transformation of developmental processes that should nurture wonder, curiosity, and trust into survival mechanisms that prioritize threat assessment, autonomous decision-making, and emotional self-protection, while creating lasting psychological adaptations that will influence adult relationship formation, career development, and family creation in ways that perpetuate cycles of institutional mistrust and interpersonal difficulty across generational boundaries, ensuring that the failures of one generation's protective systems become the psychological foundations that shape the next generation's approach to authority, cooperation, and social participation in communities that continue to fail their most vulnerable members through systematic prioritization of administrative efficiency over genuine human welfare and developmental support. In the psychological landscape of Eric Cartman's moral development, where the normal processes of childhood ethical formation should gradually establish boundaries between acceptable behavior and harmful actions through parental guidance and social feedback, there exists instead a systematic progression toward genuine evil that transcends childish selfishness or developmental immaturity to encompass sophisticated manipulation, calculated cruelty, and deliberate infliction of psychological trauma that operates according to principles so fundamentally disturbed and morally bankrupt that they challenge every assumption about the capacity for redemption and the possibility of ethical rehabilitation within individuals whose formative experiences have shaped them into instruments of systematic harm against those who trust them most completely and deserve protection rather than exploitation and betrayal. The Scott Tenorman incident represents more than elaborate revenge or childish prank gone wrong, but rather the definitive moment when Cartman crossed the threshold between antisocial behavior and genuine psychopathy through actions so calculated and cruel that they reveal psychological mechanisms operating according to principles that transcend normal human emotional processing to encompass something fundamentally alien to empathy, compassion, or basic recognition of other individuals as beings whose suffering matters beyond its utility for personal satisfaction and strategic advantage. The methodical planning required to orchestrate the deaths of Scott's parents, while simultaneously arranging for their corpses to be processed into chili that would then be served to their unsuspecting son during a public event, designed to maximize humiliation and psychological trauma, indicates cognitive capabilities and emotional detachment that exceed what any reasonable psychological framework would consider within the range of childhood behavioral problems or developmental disorders that might respond to therapeutic, intervention, or corrective guidance. The elaborate nature of Cartman's revenge scheme reveals strategic thinking and long-term planning capabilities that demonstrate remarkable intellectual sophistication while simultaneously displaying complete absence of moral, reasoning, or emotional recognition of the human cost associated with his actions, suggesting psychological development that has proceeded along purely instrumental lines where other individuals exist only as resources to be manipulated or obstacles to be eliminated through whatever methods prove most effective, regardless of ethical considerations or emotional consequences that would constrain normal individuals from pursuing such destructive courses of action. His ability to maintain normal social interactions and emotional presentations while secretly orchestrating murder and cannibalism indicates either sophisticated psychological compartmentalization or fundamental absence of normal human emotional responses that enable recognition of moral boundaries and empathetic connection with other individuals who possess their own autonomous experiences and inherent value beyond their utility for personal objectives. The $16.12 that motivated Cartman's elaborate murder scheme demonstrates how trivial provocations can trigger responses so disproportionate and cruel that they reveal underlying psychological structures operating according to principles that bear no relationship to normal conflict resolution or proportional response patterns that characterize healthy human social interaction, indicating that his capacity for violence and psychological manipulation exists independently of external provocation, while seeking opportunities for expression through whatever circumstances present themselves, regardless of the severity of the initial conflict or the availability of alternative resolution strategies that would achieve practical objectives without inflicting devastating harm upon innocent individuals who become collateral damage in his pursuit of personal satisfaction through others' suffering. The satisfaction that Cartman demonstrated while revealing the true nature of his chili to Scott Tenorman indicates psychological reward systems that derive genuine pleasure from others' psychological trauma and emotional devastation, while displaying complete absence of remorse or empathetic recognition of the profound damage inflicted through his actions, suggesting neurological and emotional development that has proceeded without normal moral constraint mechanisms that prevent most individuals from finding satisfaction in others' suffering, while enabling recognition of shared humanity that creates psychological barriers to inflicting deliberate harm upon other individuals who possess the same capacity for pain and emotional devastation that would make such actions personally traumatic for psychologically healthy individuals. The exploitation of Kenny's terminal illness for personal business advantage reveals Cartman's systematic approach to identifying opportunities for profit and manipulation within others' vulnerability and genuine emotional distress, while demonstrating remarkable ability to simulate appropriate emotional responses and compassionate concern that enable him to gain trust and cooperation from individuals whose authentic grief and desperation he cynically exploits for personal gain without experiencing normal, psychological discomfort, or moral conflict that would prevent most individuals from treating others' suffering as business opportunities rather than occasions for genuine support and compassionate assistance during times of crisis and emotional need. The stem cell research campaign that Cartman orchestrated while Kenny lay dying represents sophisticated understanding of political processes and public relations strategies that enable manipulation of governmental policy and public opinion through appeals to moral principles and humanitarian concerns that he personally does not share, while recognizing their effectiveness for achieving strategic objectives that serve his personal interests, rather than the stated humanitarian goals that provide public justification for his advocacy efforts. His ability to present compelling arguments for stem cell research while remaining completely indifferent to Kenny's actual welfare demonstrates strategic intelligence and manipulative capabilities that operate independently of genuine moral conviction or emotional attachment, while enabling exploitation of others' authentic moral commitments for purposes that contradict the ethical principles being publicly advocated. The revelation that Cartman's entire stem cell research advocacy served only to legalize the collection of fetal tissue for his pizza restaurant venture exposes the depths of his capacity for long-term deception and strategic manipulation, while demonstrating complete instrumentalization of both Kenny's suffering and public policy processes that he treats as resources to be exploited rather than systems designed to serve legitimate human welfare and social progress. The calculating nature of his business plan and his willingness to exploit his dying friend's condition for commercial advantage indicate psychological development that has proceeded without normal attachment formation or empathetic connection, while creating sophisticated strategic thinking capabilities that serve purely selfish objectives without regard for collateral damage to individuals who trust him and depend upon his support during vulnerable circumstances. The HIV infection scheme that Cartman perpetrated against Kyle represents escalation in his capacity for deliberate harm, while demonstrating increasing sophistication in his understanding of psychological manipulation and biological warfare as tools for inflicting long-term damage upon individuals who oppose his interests or challenge his authority within social group dynamics. His casual treatment of potentially fatal disease transmission as harmless prank reveals psychological disconnect from the reality of physical suffering and medical consequences, while indicating complete absence of normal fear responses and empathetic recognition that would prevent most individuals from deliberately exposing others to life-threatening infections, regardless of interpersonal conflict or personal grievances that might motivate desires for revenge or retaliation. The religious and historical manipulation that characterizes Cartman's Mel Gibson fan club demonstrates his systematic exploitation of cultural symbols and community institutions for purposes that contradict their stated values, while revealing sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social influence mechanisms that enable him to recruit unwitting participants for activities that serve his personal ideological objectives rather than the community service or cultural appreciation that provides public justification for organizational membership and participation. His ability to transform legitimate cultural organization into vehicle for hate group activities while maintaining plausible deniability about his true intentions indicates strategic thinking and manipulative capabilities that exceed what any reasonable framework would consider appropriate for childhood social development or normal peer group leadership experiences. The pattern of escalation that characterizes Cartman's increasingly sophisticated schemes reveals psychological development that proceeds toward greater capacity for harm while incorporating lessons learned from previous manipulation, successes and failures into more effective strategies for achieving personal objectives through others' exploitation and suffering, indicating systematic refinement of antisocial capabilities rather than normal moral development that would establish increasing recognition of ethical boundaries and empathetic connection with other individuals whose welfare becomes progressively more important as emotional maturity and social understanding develop through positive relationship experiences and moral education. The psychological manipulation techniques that Cartman employs demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability and emotional needs, while revealing complete absence of reciprocal vulnerability or authentic emotional investment in the relationships he systematically exploits for personal advantage, indicating development of predatory social skills that enable identification and exploitation of others' psychological weaknesses without corresponding development of genuine emotional attachment or moral commitment that would create internal constraints against deliberate harm toward individuals who trust him and depend upon his friendship and support during difficult circumstances. The charismatic leadership abilities that enable Cartman to recruit others for his various schemes reveal remarkable social intelligence and persuasive capabilities, while demonstrating complete instrumentalization of social relationships and community connections that he treats as resources to be exploited rather than meaningful human bonds that create mutual obligations and emotional commitments toward shared welfare and collective flourishing. His ability to inspire genuine loyalty and enthusiastic participation from individuals who remain unaware of his true objectives indicates psychological sophistication that operates without corresponding moral development, while creating conditions where his personal advancement proceeds through systematic exploitation of others' trust and authentic commitment to shared goals and values. The business acumen that characterizes Cartman's various entrepreneurial ventures demonstrates remarkable understanding of economic principles and market dynamics, while revealing systematic approach to identifying profit opportunities within others' vulnerability and desperation, indicating cognitive development that proceeds along purely instrumental lines without corresponding development of ethical constraints or social responsibility that would prevent exploitation of human suffering for personal economic advantage. His ability to transform various forms of human misery into profitable business opportunities while maintaining plausible legitimacy for his enterprises indicates strategic thinking capabilities that operate without moral limitation, while Faidom, recognizing the importance of public relations and legal compliance for protecting his interests from external interference or regulatory oversight. The institutional manipulation that enables Cartman to exploit educational, religious, and governmental systems for personal advantage reveals sophisticated understanding of organizational psychology and bureaucratic processes, while demonstrating systematic approach to identifying vulnerabilities within social institutions that can be exploited for personal benefit without regard for damage to institutional integrity or public trust in community organizations and governmental agencies that depend upon good faith, participation, and ethical behavior from community members for effective operation and legitimate authority. His success in manipulating various institutional systems indicates either remarkable strategic intelligence or systematic exposure to institutional vulnerabilities that exceed what normal childhood social experience would provide without specialized training or guidance from individuals with extensive experience in organizational manipulation and exploitation. The psychological warfare techniques that Cartman employs against his targets reveal understanding of emotional vulnerability and trauma response patterns that enables systematic infliction of psychological damage through precisely calculated interventions designed to maximize emotional suffering, while minimizing legal exposure or social accountability for his actions, indicating either natural psychological sophistication that exceeds normal childhood development or systematic instruction in psychological manipulation techniques that would be inappropriate for childhood education while serving purposes that remain hidden from normal community observation and oversight. His ability to identify and exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities while avoiding detection suggests strategic thinking and tactical planning capabilities that operate according to principles derived from professional manipulation and control techniques, rather than normal childhood social development. The family dynamics that shape and reflect Cartman's psychological development reveal systematic dysfunction and emotional neglect that create conditions where antisocial behavior receives reinforcement while normal moral development remains absent from family interaction patterns that should provide ethical guidance and emotional support during crucial identity formation phases of psychological development. The enabling behavior and narcissistic modeling that characterize his family environment indicate intergenerational patterns of manipulation and emotional exploitation that have created psychological foundations for his systematic instrumentalization of social relationships while preventing development of authentic emotional attachment and moral reasoning capabilities that would constrain his capacity for deliberate harm against others. The community response patterns that enable Cartman's continued operation within South Park's social systems reveal systematic failure of adult supervision and institutional oversight, while demonstrating collective inability or unwillingness to recognize and address obvious signs of dangerous psychological development that pose ongoing threats to community safety and individual welfare among vulnerable populations who cannot protect themselves from sophisticated manipulation and deliberate harm. The recurring pattern of adult authority figures failing to recognize or appropriately respond to Cartman's increasingly dangerous behavior indicates either institutional incompetence or systematic barriers to effective intervention that enable predatory individuals to continue operating within community systems while their victims remain without adequate protection or support. The long-term trajectory of Cartman's psychological development suggests systematic progression toward adult psychopathy through childhood experiences that have eliminated normal moral constraint mechanisms while developing sophisticated manipulation and exploitation capabilities that will enable continued predatory behavior throughout his adult life, unless extraordinary intervention occurs to address fundamental psychological structures that operate according to principles completely incompatible with normal human, social cooperation and ethical behavior. The absence of genuine remorse or behavioral change, despite repeated exposure to consequences and therapeutic intervention, indicates psychological formations that may exceed the capacity of conventional treatment approaches, while posing ongoing risks to community safety and individual welfare that transcend normal criminal behavior to encompass systematic threats to social cohesion and collective security. The ultimate horror of Cartman's moral development lies not in any specific act of cruelty or manipulation, but in the systematic transformation of normal childhood social development into something genuinely monstrous while maintaining superficial appearances of normal peer relationships and community participation that enable continued operation within social systems that remain unprepared to recognize or address the presence of genuine evil operating within childhood populations who should be receiving protection and guidance rather than developing capabilities for systematic harm against those who trust them most completely and depend upon their friendship for emotional support and social connection during vulnerable developmental phases when psychological security should be establishing foundations for lifelong capacity for love and ethical behavior. In the sacred territories of human experience where certain boundaries should remain inviolate and particular sanctities must be preserved to maintain the psychological and social foundations upon which civilized behavior depends. South Park has systematically crossed every conceivable line while venturing into realms of violation so profound and disturbing that they challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of comedy, the purpose of entertainment, and the responsibility that creators bear toward audiences who trust them to provide satirical commentary rather than genuine psychological assault disguised as animated humor that exploits the most vulnerable aspects of human dignity and spiritual security for purposes that transcend artistic expression to encompass something approaching deliberate desecration of everything that human beings hold sacred as protection against existential terror and moral chaos. The tolerance camp allegory that emerged from Mr. Garrison's increasingly inappropriate classroom behavior represents more than simple satirical commentary about political correctness or educational policy failures, but rather systematic exploration of how genuine concerns about predatory behavior become transformed through institutional processing into persecution of those who attempt to protect children from obvious dangers that adult authorities refuse to acknowledge or address through appropriate intervention and protective measures. The visual presentation of the tolerance camp through concentration camp imagery and black and white cinematography deliberately invokes historical genocide while creating psychological associations between legitimate child protection efforts and systematic persecution of minority populations, indicating satirical strategies that operate through traumatic historical reference points to create emotional impact that transcends rational analysis of the underlying social and political issues being addressed. The boys' desperate attempts to report obviously inappropriate adult behavior while facing systematic dismissal and punishment from authority figures who interpret their legitimate safety concerns as evidence of prejudice and intolerance reveals institutional mechanisms that prioritize ideological compliance over child welfare, while creating conditions where predatory behavior receives protection through appeals to progressive values that become weaponized against the very populations they claim to protect. The transformation of genuine safety reporting into evidence of discriminatory attitudes demonstrates how institutional ideologies can become disconnected from practical child protection needs, while creating systematic barriers to appropriate intervention during situations where vulnerable individuals face immediate danger from adults who exploit progressive rhetoric to deflect accountability and continue harmful behavior. The psychological torture that characterizes the tolerance camp experience operates through systematic suppression of authentic expression, while forcing ideological conformity through techniques that mirror historical totalitarian indoctrination programs, while being presented as educational intervention designed to promote social harmony and inclusive values. The finger-painting exercise that requires specific ideological content while punishing creative expression or independent thought reveals educational approaches that operate through psychological conditioning rather than genuine moral development, while creating traumatic associations between artistic creativity and punishment that will influence victims' approach to self-expression and autonomous thinking throughout their lives. The starvation and physical abuse that supplement ideological conditioning within the tolerance camp environment demonstrates systematic dehumanization processes that reduce individual identity to ideological compliance while eliminating personal autonomy and creative expression through methods that exceed psychological manipulation to encompass physical torture, designed to break individual resistance to institutional control and thought modification. The combination of physical deprivation with psychological conditioning creates trauma bonding mechanisms that ensure lasting psychological impact while establishing patterns of institutional compliance that will influence victims' relationship to authority and ideological conformity long after their release from direct institutional control. The North American Man-Boy Love Association episode ventures into territory so disturbing and socially dangerous that its satirical intentions become obscured by the psychological impact of exposing audiences to predatory recruitment, strategies and manipulation techniques while presenting child sexual exploitation through comedy frameworks that may normalize or trivialize genuine threats to child safety through humor that reduces serious criminal behavior to satirical commentary about social organizations and political activism. The episode's exploration of predatory grooming techniques and organizational recruitment strategies provides detailed information about criminal methodologies, while presenting such information through entertainment media that reaches audiences, including children who might become targets for similar exploitation attempts by real predatory organizations operating within their communities. The manipulation of Cartman's naivety regarding the organization's true purposes demonstrates how predatory groups exploit children's natural desire for adult approval and social belonging while using legitimate-sounding organizational structures and community service rhetoric to disguise criminal intentions and facilitate access to potential victims who remain unaware of the dangers they face through participation in activities that appear harmless or beneficial. The episode's detailed presentation of grooming techniques and recruitment strategies provides educational content about predatory behavior patterns, while simultaneously creating entertainment value from situations that involve genuine threats to child welfare and community safety. The Mr. slave relationship dynamic that triggers the entire tolerance camp narrative operates through systematic presentation of inappropriate adult behavior that deliberately confuses legitimate boundaries between appropriate educational content and sexually explicit material, while creating situations where children's natural discomfort with adult sexual behavior becomes reframed as evidence of prejudice rather than healthy psychological boundaries that protect developmental processes from premature exposure to adult sexual content that exceeds their emotional processing capabilities and psychological readiness. The Lemmy-Winks narrative that parallels the main tolerance camp storyline creates additional layers of violation through anthropomorphic animal characters experiencing sexual trauma that becomes presented through adventure, story frameworks, and musical numbers that disguise the disturbing nature of the content while creating psychological associations between childhood entertainment formats and sexual violence that may influence young viewers' understanding of appropriate entertainment content and acceptable adult behavior toward children and animals within domestic and educational environments. The Human Centipede episode represents perhaps the most systematic violation of human dignity ever presented through animated television, while exploring themes of corporate exploitation and consumer manipulation through imagery and scenarios so disturbing that they challenge viewers' capacity to process the content as satirical commentary rather than genuine psychological assault designed to create trauma responses and lasting psychological impact that extends far beyond normal entertainment consumption patterns. The episode's exploration of technological consent violations and corporate abuse of user agreements provides relevant social commentary, while presenting such commentary through scenarios that exceed satirical necessity to encompass graphic depictions of human degradation and systematic torture. The forced participation that Kyle experiences through manipulated consent agreements demonstrates how corporate entities exploit legal technicalities and consumer inattention to create conditions where individuals become trapped in exploitative relationships that violate fundamental human dignity, while maintaining technical legal compliance through consent mechanisms that disguise coercive circumstances and manipulative practices. The systematic dehumanization that characterizes Kyle's experience reflects broader patterns of corporate exploitation, while being presented through imagery so disturbing that the satirical message becomes secondary to the psychological impact of witnessing systematic human degradation. Presented as entertainment content, the technological horror elements that supplement the corporate satire create additional layers of violation through systematic exploration of how digital connectivity and technological dependency create vulnerabilities that enable unprecedented forms of exploitation and control, while presenting such themes through scenarios that exceed rational satirical necessity to encompass graphic exploration of human suffering and degradation for entertainment purposes that serve no legitimate educational or social commentary functions. Beyond creating shock value and psychological impact, the religious mockery that characterizes numerous South Park episodes operates through systematic desecration of sacred symbols and spiritual concepts, while presenting such content through comedy frameworks that may provide psychological protection for audiences who share the religious traditions. Being mocked but create genuine spiritual trauma for individuals whose faith communities and personal spiritual development become targets for systematic ridicule and theological contradiction that challenges fundamental beliefs about divine authority and spiritual meaning. The Christmas episodes that regularly feature satanic imagery and deliberate inversion of Christian symbolism create particularly disturbing combinations of childhood innocence and religious desecration, while using holiday traditions and family celebration frameworks to present content that systematically violates spiritual boundaries and cultural sanctities through methods that exceed satirical commentary to encompass deliberate spiritual assault against audiences whose religious backgrounds make them vulnerable to psychological trauma through exposure to systematic mockery of their most deeply held beliefs and spiritual commitments. The celebrity death humor that characterizes episodes featuring recently deceased public figures operates through systematic exploitation of grief and cultural mourning processes, while presenting deceased individuals through scenarios that violate dignity and memorial customs that provide psychological protection for communities processing collective loss and cultural transitions. The timing of such episodes in relationship to actual deaths demonstrates systematic exploitation of current events and public emotional vulnerability for entertainment purposes that serve no legitimate satirical or educational functions, while potentially creating lasting psychological associations between grief processing and entertainment consumption. The educational violation that occurs through systematic presentation of inappropriate content to audiences that include children creates conditions where entertainment media becomes vehicle for exposing developing minds to psychological and spiritual content that exceeds their developmental capacity. while being presented through formats that appear appropriate for general audiences despite containing material that would be considered harmful or inappropriate in most educational or family entertainment contexts. The institutional critique that provides ostensible justification for boundary violation often becomes secondary to the psychological impact of the violations themselves, while creating conditions where legitimate social commentary becomes contaminated by gratuitous exploration of human degradation and spiritual desecration that serves no constructive purpose beyond creating shock value and entertainment novelty through systematic violation of cultural and psychological boundaries that exist to protect individual and community welfare from unnecessary exposure to traumatic content and destructive ideological influences. The artistic freedom arguments that defend such systematic boundary violation often ignore the psychological and social costs associated with regular exposure to content that challenges fundamental human dignity and spiritual security, while creating entertainment industry precedents that normalize increasingly extreme content and encourage creative competition through escalating violation of cultural sanctities and individual psychological boundaries that serve protective functions for both creators and audiences who depend upon entertainment media for psychological relaxation and cultural reinforcement rather than systematic assault upon their deepest beliefs and emotional securities. The ultimate horror of systematic sacred boundary violation lies not in any specific episode or satirical target, but in the cumulative impact of regular exposure to entertainment content that treats human dignity and spiritual security as expendable resources for creating shock value and entertainment novelty, while establishing cultural precedents that normalize systematic desecration of everything that human beings hold sacred as protection against existential terror and moral chaos, creating conditions where entertainment consumption becomes indistinguishable from psychological warfare, while audiences gradually lose access to cultural and spiritual resources that provide meaning and emotional security within communities that depend upon shared sanctities for social cohesion and collective psychological health. In the fundamental architecture of institutional protection that should safeguard society's most vulnerable members through coordinated systems of family support, educational oversight, and community intervention, South Park presents a comprehensive portrait of systematic failure, so complete and pervasive that it transcends individual incompetence or isolated dysfunction to encompass civilizational collapse, where every institution designed to protect children has become either actively harmful or passively negligent, while creating conditions where the most vulnerable members of society must fend for themselves against dangers that exceed their developmental capacity to understand or overcome through individual effort and autonomous parias. Decision-making that should be supplemented by reliable adult guidance and institutional protection rather than serving as the sole defense against predatory behavior and systematic exploitation. The recurring pattern of adult authority figures demonstrating criminal negligence in their professional responsibilities, while maintaining positions of power over vulnerable populations, reveals institutional selection processes and accountability mechanisms that have become so fundamentally corrupted that they consistently reward incompetence while punishing competence and ethical behavior through systematic barriers to effective intervention and appropriate response to obvious dangers that threaten individual welfare and community safety. The teachers who ignore obvious signs of abuse and distress while focusing on bureaucratic compliance and administrative convenience demonstrate educational systems that have lost connection to their fundamental protective mission while developing institutional cultures that prioritize superficial order over genuine student welfare and safety. The administrative leadership that governs South Park's educational and social service institutions operates according to principles that systematically prevent effective response to child welfare concerns, while creating bureaucratic barriers that protect institutional reputation at the expense of individual safety and community well-being through policies and procedures that discourage reporting of problems, while punishing individuals who attempt to advocate for appropriate intervention and protective measures. The principal's office serves as symbolic representation of authority that exists primarily for self-preservation, rather than service to the populations it claims to protect, while demonstrating systematic disconnection from the FIME's actual experiences and needs of children who depend upon institutional protection for physical safety and psychological security. Kenny McCormick's family situation represents the intersection of multiple institutional failures, where educational systems, social services, and law enforcement agencies collectively abandon their protective responsibilities while enabling systematic child neglect and exploitation through bureaucratic indifference and professional incompetence that allows dangerous conditions to persist indefinitely without appropriate intervention or support for vulnerable family members who lack resources for self-protection and advocacy. The poverty that traps the McCormick family creates conditions where parents turn to illegal drug manufacturing and distribution, while children experience malnutrition, inadequate shelter, and exposure to criminal activity that should trigger immediate intervention from multiple institutional protection systems. The normalization of Kenny's repeated deaths within the community demonstrates systematic desensitization to child welfare concerns, while revealing institutional mechanisms that prevent appropriate investigation and response to obvious patterns of danger and harm that should generate immediate protective intervention and comprehensive family support services. The casual acceptance of obviously suspicious circumstances surrounding a child's welfare indicates institutional systems that have become so dysfunctional that they cannot distinguish between normal childhood experiences and systematic abuse or neglect that requires immediate professional intervention and legal action to protect vulnerable individuals from continued harm. The meth manufacturing operation that Kenny's parents conduct within their family home creates exposure to toxic chemicals, criminal activity, and law enforcement dangers, while social services and educational institutions remain apparently unaware of conditions that should be immediately obvious to any competent professional assessment of family circumstances and child welfare needs. The systematic failure to recognize or respond to clear indicators of criminal activity and child endangerment reveals institutional incompetence that extends beyond simple oversight to encompass systematic negligence that enables continued harm to vulnerable populations who depend upon institutional protection for basic safety and developmental support. Butterscotch's home environment represents perhaps the most systematic example of institutional failure to protect children from psychological abuse and emotional manipulation that operates through sophisticated techniques designed to avoid detection while inflicting maximum psychological damage upon developing personalities and identity formation processes that should receive protection and nurturing support, rather than systematic undermining and emotional terrorism disguised as parental discipline and moral processes that should receive protection, instruction. The elaborate punishment systems and psychological manipulation techniques that characterize his family interactions demonstrate abuse patterns that should trigger immediate intervention from educational professionals, medical personnel, and social service agencies that possess training and authority to recognize and address such systematic child maltreatment. The educational system's failure to recognize obvious signs of psychological trauma and systematic abuse in Butter's behavior and academic performance reveals institutional incompetence that exceeds simple oversight to encompass systematic negligence in professional responsibility, while demonstrating complete absence of effective training and supervision systems that should enable educational personnel to identify and respond appropriately to clear indicators of child abuse and family dysfunction that require immediate, protective intervention and therapeutic support services. The grounding punishment that keeps Butters isolated within his abusive family environment for extended periods while preventing normal social interaction and peer support demonstrates systematic family control mechanisms that should trigger immediate concern from educational professionals who observe sudden changes in student behavior and social participation patterns. Yet such obvious warning signs consistently fail to generate appropriate investigation or intervention from institutional authorities who possess legal responsibility for student welfare and protection from harmful family situations. The attempted murder incident where Linda Stotch tries to drown Butters while presenting the action as suicide murder, motivated by family shame, reveals abuse escalation patterns that should have been prevented through earlier intervention and family support services. Yet the systematic failure of institutional protection systems enabled abuse patterns to develop to life-threatening levels without appropriate recognition or response from professional authorities who possessed multiple opportunities to identify and address dangerous family dynamics before they reached crisis levels requiring emergency intervention and criminal prosecution. The community's collective failure to recognize systematic patterns of institutional neglect and child endangerment demonstrates social systems that have become so accustomed to dysfunction that obviously inappropriate circumstances become normalized within community awareness while generating no collective pressure for institutional reform or individual accountability from professional authorities who continue operating within systems that consistently fail their stated missions and legal responsibilities toward vulnerable populations. The Dead Kids episode presents systematic normalization of school violence as routine inconvenience rather than emergency, requiring comprehensive response and institutional restructuring to address fundamental safety failures and implement effective protective measures for student populations who deserve secure educational environments rather than acceptance that violence represents an inevitable aspect of contemporary educational experience that must be accommodated through procedural adjustments rather than eliminated through systematic institutional change and community commitment to child protection. Sharon Marsh's isolation and ridicule for expressing normal concern about school violence demonstrates community response patterns that punish appropriate advocacy for child safety while rewarding institutional negligence and administrative convenience that prioritizes superficial order over genuine security and welfare concerns that should generate immediate collective response and comprehensive institutional reform to address systemic failures that enable repeated incidents of violence and trauma within educational environments that should provide safety and developmental support for vulnerable student populations. The bureaucratic response to repeated incidents of school violence reveals institutional mechanisms that prioritize damage control and liability management over genuine student protection, while creating policy frameworks that address superficial symptoms rather than underlying causes of institutional dysfunction that enable dangerous individuals and circumstances to threaten student safety without appropriate preventive intervention or effective security measures that might prevent continued incidents and protect vulnerable populations from foreseeable harm. The Catholic Church Cleanup Crew episode presents systematic institutional cover-up operations that protect organizational reputation while endangering vulnerable populations through deliberate suppression of evidence and intimidation of witnesses who attempt to report criminal activity and seek justice for victims of institutional abuse and negligence. The gangster-like operations that characterize institutional protection efforts reveal organizational priorities that place administrative convenience and public relations concerns above victim welfare and community safety, while demonstrating systematic corruption that extends throughout hierarchical authority structures. The professional competence of the cleanup crew operations demonstrates institutional investment in cover-up capabilities that exceeds investment in genuine child protection and abuse prevention, while revealing systematic preparation for managing criminal exposure rather than preventing criminal behavior through appropriate oversight and accountability mechanisms that should prevent institutional abuse and protect vulnerable populations from predatory behavior by individuals in positions of authority and trust. The foster care system that processes Kenny and his siblings after their parents' arrest demonstrates additional layers of institutional failure, where protective services become additional sources of exploitation and trauma rather than genuine refuge and support for children escaping dangerous family situations, indicating systematic dysfunction that pervades all levels of child protection infrastructure while creating conditions where vulnerable individuals face continued danger regardless of institutional intervention and official protective custody. The reality television exploitation that transforms Kenny's family crisis into entertainment content demonstrates systematic commodification of human suffering, while revealing institutional mechanisms that prioritize profit generation over genuine welfare concerns for vulnerable populations, whose personal tragedies become content for public consumption through media systems that exploit crisis situations, rather than providing appropriate support and intervention services that might address underlying problems and protect vulnerable individuals from continued exploitation. The normalization of institutional failure within South Park's community demonstrates collective adaptation to dysfunction that enables continued operation of systems that consistently fail their stated missions, while community members develop expectations so reduced that obviously inadequate. Performance becomes acceptable through lowered standards and resigned acceptance that institutional incompetence represents an inevitable aspect of social organization, rather than correctable dysfunction that could be addressed through appropriate accountability mechanisms and systematic reform efforts. The legal system's failure to provide appropriate prosecution and accountability for obvious institutional crimes and professional negligence reveals justice mechanisms that protect institutional interests rather than victim welfare, while creating conditions where systematic abuse and neglect continue without meaningful consequences for individuals and organizations that betray their professional responsibilities and legal obligations toward vulnerable populations who depend upon institutional protection for basic safety, developmental support. The ultimate tragedy of systematic institutional failure lies not in any specific incident or individual case of negligence, but in the complete transformation of protective systems into sources of additional danger, while creating social conditions where the most vulnerable members of society must develop autonomous survival strategies and peer support networks to compensate for institutional systems that have abandoned their fundamental protective missions in favor of self-preservation and administrative convenience that prioritizes organizational survival over genuine service to populations who depend upon institutional competence for basic safety and developmental support in communities that claim to value child welfare while systematically enabling continued harm through institutional negligence and professional incompetence. In the merciless machinery of contemporary media culture, where celebrity existence becomes transformed into public commodity and individual human suffering is systematically converted into entertainment content for mass consumption, South Park has documented the horrifying process through which fame becomes a form of ritualized sacrifice, while exploring how media institutions and public audiences collaborate in the systematic destruction of individuals whose personal struggles and psychological deterioration provide profitable content streams that generate revenue and audience engagement through the commodification of human breakdown and the transformation of genuine mental health crises into spectacle that serves commercial interests rather than therapeutic or supportive purposes for vulnerable individuals experiencing psychological trauma under conditions of unprecedented public scrutiny and systematic invasion of privacy. The Britney Spears episode represents more than satirical commentary about celebrity culture or media exploitation, but rather systematic documentation of how modern society conducts ritualized human sacrifice through media mechanisms that transform individual psychological breakdown into collective entertainment, while creating conditions where public figures experiencing genuine mental health emergencies become trapped within systems of exploitation that prevent recovery, while generating profit from continued deterioration and psychological suffering. The graphic depiction of Spears' suicide attempt, followed by her continued performance obligations, despite catastrophic head trauma, reveals the horrifying reality that celebrity status creates conditions where individuals lose access to basic human dignity and medical care, while becoming obligated to continue providing entertainment value regardless of their capacity for conscious participation or autonomous decision-making. The media response that follows Spears' attempted suicide demonstrates systematic transformation of human tragedy into profitable content, while revealing how news organizations and entertainment media operate according to principles that prioritize audience engagement and advertising revenue over individual welfare and basic ethical considerations regarding the coverage of mental health crises and medical emergencies. The reporters who swarm around the hospitalized celebrity while demanding continued interviews and performance obligations indicate institutional systems that have eliminated normal human boundaries regarding privacy and medical recovery in favor of content generation systems that treat individual human suffering as renewable resource for producing entertainment and news products. The agricultural metaphor that characterizes the episode's exploration of celebrity sacrifice reveals systematic understanding of how modern entertainment culture operates according to ritualized patterns that mirror ancient sacrifice traditions, while incorporating technological and economic mechanisms that enable more sophisticated and sustained exploitation of individual human suffering for collective psychological satisfaction and commercial profit generation. The revelation that celebrity destruction serves broader cultural functions related to social cohesion and psychological catharsis indicates institutional systems that deliberately cultivate and destroy public figures according to cyclical patterns that serve societal needs for vicarious experience and emotional release through observing others' suffering and degradation. The Steve Irwin Halloween party incident represents systematic exploitation of recent death and family grief for entertainment purposes, while demonstrating how quickly deceased individuals become divorced from their authentic human identity and transformed into costume characters and comedic references that bear no relationship to their actual lives, or contributions while serving entertainment purposes that exploit their death circumstances and personal characteristics for humor that provides no beneficial social function beyond generating temporary audience amusement through reference to recent tragedy and family loss. The timing of the episode's broadcast, less than 2 months after Irwin's actual death, reveals systematic disregard for family mourning processes and community grief cycles while prioritizing entertainment, production schedules, and comedic opportunities over basic human decency and respectful consideration for individuals processing genuine loss and emotional trauma related to unexpected death of beloved public figure whose personal characteristics and professional contributions deserved memorial consideration rather than immediate transformation into comedic material and satirical reference points. The Hell Party setting that provides context for Irwin's appearance creates additional layers of theological violation, while suggesting that individuals whose public personas emphasized environmental conservation and animal welfare deserve eternal punishment rather than recognition for their positive contributions to education and wildlife protection efforts, indicating satirical frameworks that operate through systematic inversion of moral categories, while creating entertainment value through deliberate contradiction of audience expectations regarding justice and spiritual consequences for individual behavior and professional dedication. The Christopher Reeve portrayal represents systematic exploitation of disability and medical struggle, while transforming genuine advocacy for medical research and treatment advancement into caricature of power-hungry villainy that bears no relationship to the actual positions or activities of individuals whose paralysis and medical dependence created platforms for advancing scientific understanding and treatment options for others experiencing similar conditions. The transformation of stem cell research advocacy into vampire-like fetus consumption creates grotesque misrepresentation of legitimate medical research, while exploiting disability imagery and medical dependency for shock value that serves no constructive, satirical, or educational purpose. The superhero imagery that accompanies Reeve's villainous characterization creates additional layers of violation through systematic corruption of cultural symbols associated with heroism and moral courage, while using the actor's iconic role performance to create entertainment value through deliberate contradiction of heroic symbolism and moral expectations that audiences associate with Superman character and Reeve's personal advocacy work following his accident and disability experience. The scientific misrepresentation that characterizes the stem cell research satire creates dangerous misinformation about legitimate medical research, while potentially influencing audience understanding of important biomedical policy issues through entertainment content that prioritizes shock value and comedic impact over accurate representation of scientific methods and research objectives that could benefit individuals experiencing various medical conditions and disability circumstances through advanced therapeutic interventions and treatment development. The Randy Marsh murder of Winnie the Pooh represents systematic destruction of childhood cultural symbols, while exploring how economic pressures and international business relationships create conditions where individuals abandon moral principles and cultural values in favor of financial opportunities that require collaboration with authoritarian systems and participation in cultural suppression activities that violate basic principles of artistic freedom and creative expression. The strangulation scene that eliminates the beloved children's character demonstrates how economic incentives can transform ordinary individuals into agents of cultural destruction, while revealing the psychological mechanisms through which people justify participation in activities that contradict their stated values and moral commitments. The Chinese censorship context that motivates the Pu murder creates additional layers of cultural violation, while demonstrating how authoritarian political systems export their censorship requirements to other countries through economic pressure and business relationship leverage that forces compliance with ideological restrictions and cultural suppression policies that exceed domestic authority boundaries to encompass international cultural production and creative expression. The transformation of beloved children's entertainment into political liability demonstrates how totalitarian systems contaminate cultural resources that should remain accessible for childhood development and family bonding experiences. The Mickey Mouse corporate framework that provides business context for the murder decision reveals systematic prioritization of profit generation over cultural preservation, while demonstrating how entertainment corporations treat cultural symbols and childhood resources as expendable assets that can be eliminated whenever they create obstacles to market expansion or revenue generation opportunities in authoritarian markets that demand cultural compliance and ideological conformity as conditions for business access and commercial success. The witnessing trauma that Piglet experiences during Pu's murder creates additional psychological violation while using childhood friendship imagery to intensify emotional impact through systematic corruption of relationships and loyalty themes that should provide comfort and security within children's entertainment, rather than exposure to violence and betrayal that could create lasting psychological associations between trusted characters and traumatic experiences that exceed appropriate content boundaries for family, entertainment, and childhood cultural resources. The authentication techniques that present Pu's gentle characterization immediately before his violent death create systematic exploitation of audience attachment and emotional investment, while using accurate character portrayal to maximize psychological impact through calculated betrayal of audience expectations and emotional security that transforms beloved cultural symbol into source of trauma and psychological disturbance, rather than comfort and developmental support that such characters should provide within healthy entertainment relationships. The celebrity death pattern that emerges across multiple episodes reveals systematic approach to exploiting public grief and cultural mourning processes, while creating entertainment content that transforms recent deaths and ongoing family suffering into comedic material and satirical commentary that serves no constructive social purpose beyond generating audience shock and entertainment novelty. Through violation of cultural mourning, customs, and basic human decency regarding respect for deceased individuals and their surviving family members who deserve privacy and respectful consideration during grief processing rather than continued exploitation for entertainment purposes. The media cannibalism metaphor that underlies celebrity destruction episodes demonstrates systematic understanding of how modern entertainment culture operates through consumption of individual human suffering, while creating institutional mechanisms that transform personal tragedy into profitable content through industrial processes that eliminate individual agency and human dignity in favor of content generation systems that serve audience demand for vicarious experience and emotional stimulation through observing others, degradation and psychological breakdown under conditions of extreme public scrutiny and media exploitation. The ritual sacrifice elements that characterize celebrity destruction reveal cultural patterns that mirror ancient religious practices, while incorporating modern technological and economic mechanisms that enable more sophisticated, sustained exploitation of individual suffering for collective, psychological satisfaction and social cohesion through shared participation in systematic human destruction, disguised as entertainment, consumption, and cultural commentary that provides psychological distance from direct participation while enabling collective responsibility for individual suffering and cultural degradation. The ultimate horror of celebrity death and media cannibalism lies not in any specific episode or satirical target, but in the systematic revelation of how modern entertainment culture operates through ritualized human sacrifice, while transforming individual suffering into collective entertainment through institutional mechanisms that eliminate normal human boundaries regarding privacy, dignity, and compassionate response to medical crises and psychological breakdown, creating conditions where fame becomes form of cultural death sentence while audiences participate in systematic destruction of individuals whose only crime consists of achieving public recognition and cultural visibility that transforms them into renewable resources for entertainment production and audience engagement through consumption of human suffering disguised as satirical commentary and cultural criticism. In the systematic transformation of childhood experience, where violence becomes normalized as inevitable background reality rather than extraordinary crisis requiring immediate protective intervention and comprehensive institutional response, South Park presents a horrifying documentation of how developing minds adapt to conditions where physical harm and psychological trauma represent routine aspects of daily existence, while protective systems fail to recognize or appropriately address the cumulative impact of constant exposure to circumstances that exceed developmental capacity for healthy processing and integration into stable psychological frameworks that enable normal social functioning and emotional development throughout the lifespan. Stanley's Cup represents perhaps the most calculated exploitation of childhood hope and emotional vulnerability, while demonstrating how adult society systematically creates impossible expectations and psychological burdens that transform children into repositories for collective anxieties and unrealistic demands that exceed any reasonable standard of developmental appropriateness or psychological safety during crucial identity formation phases when young individuals should receive protection and support rather than bearing responsibility for outcomes that remain beyond their control, through circumstances that no child should be expected to navigate successfully, regardless of their individual capabilities or determination to meet adult expectations. The terminally ill child whose survival becomes contingent upon Stan's coaching success creates systematic weaponization of childhood mortality while transforming medical crisis into motivational tool that places unbearable psychological pressure upon individuals whose developmental stage should focus on skill, acquisition, and social learning, rather than life and death responsibility for others' medical outcomes through athletic performance that bears no rational relationship to cancer treatment or medical intervention. The arbitrary connection between hockey game results and child mortality reveals adult psychological mechanisms that create magical thinking patterns, while forcing children to accept impossible responsibility for circumstances that require professional medical intervention rather than sporting achievement. The Detroit Red Wings matchup that provides climactic confrontation demonstrates systematic adult cruelty through competitive arrangements that guarantee failure, while creating public humiliation experiences designed to teach lessons about realistic expectations, and competitive limitation through traumatic defeat that exceeds any reasonable educational objective or character development purpose. The professional athletes who show no mercy toward children while celebrating their overwhelming victory demonstrate institutional callousness that prioritizes competitive demonstration over appropriate consideration for developmental impact and psychological welfare of participants who lack the emotional maturity and life experience necessary to process such systematic humiliation without lasting psychological damage. The player's denunciation of Stan following the predictable defeat reveals how systematic failure to protect children from impossible expectations creates conditions where victims blame themselves and each other, rather than recognizing adult institutional responsibility for creating circumstances that guaranteed psychological trauma and emotional damage through unrealistic competitive arrangements and motivational strategies. The dying child's fate becomes sealed through sporting outcome, while demonstrating how adult society transforms medical tragedy into entertainment content and motivational narrative that serves adult emotional needs rather than genuine child welfare or appropriate medical support for families facing terminal illness. The weapon mishap that results in Butters losing his eye demonstrates systematic adult failure to provide appropriate supervision and safety oversight, while revealing how children's natural curiosity and play behaviors become dangerous when adults fail to maintain secure environments and implement basic safety protocols that should prevent access to dangerous materials and equipment that exceed appropriate risk levels for unsupervised childhood activities. The ninja weapon acquisition through con artist manipulation reveals adult commercial systems that prioritize profit over child safety, while creating access to dangerous materials through vendors who demonstrate complete disregard for age-appropriate sales practices and basic consumer protection standards. The injury response that transforms Butters into a dog reveals systematic adult coaching of children to participate in deception and cover-up activities, rather than seeking appropriate medical care and accepting responsibility for safety failures that require immediate professional intervention and honest accountability for circumstances that created preventable injury through inadequate supervision and inappropriate access to dangerous materials. The community response that focuses on Cartman's wardrobe malfunction rather than serious injury demonstrates collective priority systems that emphasize superficial concerns over genuine medical emergencies, while revealing systematic desensitization to child welfare that enables continued neglect and inappropriate response to obvious safety violations. The Woodland Critter Christmas episode represents systematic corruption of childhood innocence through deliberate inversion of wholesome imagery and seasonal celebration traditions that transform familiar comfort symbols into sources of horror and psychological trauma, while using Christmas themes and cute animal characters to disguise disturbing content that exceeds appropriate boundaries for family entertainment or holiday programming. The satanic ritual elements that emerge from initially innocent woodland creature interactions demonstrate systematic deception strategies that exploit trust and cultural familiarity to create maximum psychological impact through calculated betrayal of audience expectations and emotional security. The animal sacrifice and cannibalism that characterizes the woodland creature's holiday preparation reveals systematic transformation of nurturing and protective imagery into predatory and destructive behavior patterns, while using anthropomorphic animal characters to present disturbing content through formats that appear suitable for general audiences. despite containing material that exceeds appropriate content boundaries for viewers of any age. The blood feast celebrations and demonic worship activities create systematic contamination of Christmas imagery and seasonal celebration themes, while transforming holiday traditions into context for horror and psychological disturbance. The rabbit sacrifice scene that Stan witnesses creates systematic exposure to graphic violence through imagery that combines childhood entertainment formats with disturbing content, while forcing participation in activities that violate basic moral boundaries and psychological safety requirements for healthy development and emotional stability. The enthusiastic participation that characterizes the woodland creature's approach to violence and ritual sacrifice demonstrates systematic normalization of cruelty and harmful behavior through presentations that make such activities appear natural and appropriate within community contexts that should provide safety and moral guidance, rather than exposure to destructive ideologies and traumatic experiences. Man-Bear-Pig's killing spree represents environmental apocalypse made manifest through systematic violence that transforms abstract policy concerns into immediate physical threat, while creating conditions where theoretical dangers become realized through graphic presentation of mass destruction and individual mortality that exceeds satirical necessity to encompass horror imagery designed to create lasting psychological impact rather than constructive engagement with environmental policy issues or climate change. Awareness. The grotesque monster imagery that accompanies environmental destruction creates systematic association between ecological concerns and horror experiences, while transforming legitimate policy discussion into traumatic content. Consumption. The governmental and community response that prioritizes entertainment consumption over immediate protective action reveals systematic institutional failure during crisis situations, while demonstrating how modern society continues routine activities and pleasure-seeking behaviors, even when facing existential threats that require immediate collective action and resource mobilization to protect vulnerable populations from foreseeable harm. The Red Dead Redemption 2 gaming preference that supersedes crisis response indicates cultural priority systems that emphasize individual entertainment over collective survival, while revealing psychological adaptation mechanisms that enable continued normal behavior despite awareness of developing catastrophe. The intergenerational burden transfer that characterizes adult response to environmental crisis creates systematic exploitation of childhood responsibility while transforming policy failures and adult institutional inadequacy into problems that future generations must solve through mechanisms that enable current adults to avoid accountability for creating circumstances that require immediate intervention, rather than delayed response from individuals who lack current political authority or resource access necessary for effective crisis management and institutional reform. The normalization of extreme violence as background noise throughout South Park's documented history reveals systematic desensitization processes that enable continued exposure to traumatic content without appropriate psychological processing or recovery periods that would allow healthy integration of disturbing experiences into stable emotional frameworks. The casual acceptance of death and injury that characterizes community response patterns indicates cultural adaptation mechanisms that prioritize functional continuity over genuine healing and trauma recovery, while creating conditions where individuals must suppress normal emotional responses to maintain social acceptance and institutional participation. The recurring pattern of children experiencing violence while adults remain absent or incompetent demonstrates systematic failure of protective institutions, while creating conditions where developing individuals must process traumatic experiences without appropriate support or therapeutic intervention that might prevent lasting psychological damage and behavioral adaptation problems that will influence adult relationship formation and social functioning throughout their lives. The independence that children develop through necessity when facing violent circumstances creates premature emotional maturation while preventing normal developmental processes that require safety and stability for healthy progression through identity formation phases. The entertainment value that derives from childhood exposure to violence reveals cultural mechanisms that transform individual trauma into collective amusement, while creating institutional systems that profit from systematic presentation of disturbing content through formats that provide psychological distance for audiences who consume violent imagery without experiencing direct consequences, or accepting responsibility for cultural systems that normalize harmful behavior and traumatic experience as routine aspects of contemporary social organization. The psychological adaptation that enables continued functioning despite regular violence exposure creates internal defense mechanisms that may prove counterproductive in safer environments, while establishing behavioral patterns and emotional processing systems that assume danger as baseline condition rather than recognizing safety and stability as normal circumstances that enable healthy development and authentic relationship formation with individuals who deserve trust and emotional investment rather than constant vigilance and defensive positioning. The ultimate horror of systematic violence normalization lies not in any specific incident or traumatic experience, but in the complete transformation of childhood development from protected exploration and gradual skill acquisition into survival training that prepares individuals for continued exposure to dangerous circumstances while creating psychological foundations that assume violence and trauma as inevitable aspects of human experience rather than correctable social problems that could be addressed through appropriate institutional reform and collective commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from unnecessary harm and traumatic experience that serves no constructive developmental or educational purpose, beyond creating conditions where individuals adapt to dysfunction rather than demanding and creating healthier social systems that prioritize genuine welfare over institutional convenience and cultural entertainment derived from others' suffering. In the realm of psychological deterioration, where individual identity becomes systematically dismantled through exposure to substances, ideological manipulation, and environmental stresses that exceed human capacity for healthy adaptation, South Park documents the horrifying process through which mental stability transforms into fragmented consciousness, while exploring how various forms of psychological assault operate to destroy authentic selfhood and replace coherent personality structures with damaged psychological frameworks that serve external manipulation and control rather than individual well-being and autonomous development throughout crucial identity formation phases, when psychological security should establish foundations for lifelong mental health and crucial emotional resilience. Jimmy Valmer's descent into steroid-induced personality transformation represents systematic documentation of how performance-enhancing substances create psychological changes that exceed physical effects to encompass complete personality restructuring, while demonstrating how competitive pressures and achievement expectations can drive individuals toward chemical interventions that promise enhanced capabilities at the cost of authentic identity and emotional stability. The initial decision to use steroids as performance enhancement reveals psychological vulnerability to external pressure, while indicating insufficient support systems and guidance mechanisms that might provide alternative approaches to addressing competitive challenges and performance anxiety through healthy skill development and psychological preparation techniques. The gradual personality changes that characterize Jimmy's steroid use demonstrate systematic psychological deterioration through chemical intervention, while revealing how substances that enhance physical performance simultaneously undermine emotional regulation and interpersonal relationship capabilities through neurochemical alterations that affect judgment, empathy, and behavioral control mechanisms that enable healthy social interaction and authentic self-expression. The aggressive behavior patterns and emotional volatility that emerge during steroid use indicate systematic disruption of normal psychological processing while creating conditions where individual identity becomes subordinated to chemical influence rather than autonomous decision-making and authentic personality expression. The relationship destruction that accompanies Jimmy's chemical dependency creates systematic isolation from supportive social connections, while demonstrating how substance-induced personality changes eliminate access to emotional resources and interpersonal support systems that might provide intervention and recovery assistance during crucial phases when individual agency remains sufficient for making choices about continued substance use versus seeking help through therapeutic intervention and community support networks. The girlfriend confrontation that reveals the extent of Jimmy's psychological transformation demonstrates how chemical dependency creates conditions where loved ones become unable to recognize or effectively communicate with common individuals whose personalities have been fundamentally altered through neurochemical manipulation. The physical violence that emerges from Jimmy's psychological deterioration represents escalation in behavioral dysfunction, while revealing how performance-enhancing substances create systematic progression toward increasingly dangerous and antisocial behaviors that threaten both user welfare and community safety through aggressive actions that reflect chemical influence rather than authentic personality characteristics or conscious behavioral choices. The unpredictable nature of steroid-induced aggression creates conditions where individuals become dangerous to themselves and others, while losing access to normal behavioral control mechanisms that enable appropriate response to social situations and interpersonal conflict. The mirror confrontation that provides climactic recognition of psychological transformation demonstrates systematic awareness breakthrough while revealing how external perspective and honest feedback from trusted sources can penetrate chemical-induced psychological distortion to enable recognition of personality changes that remain invisible from internal perspective due to gradual adaptation and chemical influence on self-perception and behavioral evaluation systems. Timmy's intervention represents authentic friendship and supportive confrontation that enables recovery awareness while demonstrating importance of maintaining social connections during periods of psychological vulnerability and chemical dependency. Mr. Garrison's surgical transformation creates systematic exploration of identity fragmentation through medical intervention, while revealing how gender transition procedures become complicated by underlying psychological instability and personality disorders that require therapeutic intervention, rather than surgical solution to address fundamental identity, confusion, and emotional dysfunction that manifests through gender dysphoria, but originates from broader psychological development problems and interpersonal relationship difficulties that exceed gender identity issues to encompass comprehensive personality reconstruction needs. The graphic surgical presentation that accompanies Garrison's transformation creates systematic exposure to medical procedures through explicit visual documentation that exceeds educational necessity to encompass shock value and psychological impact, designed to create lasting mental associations between gender transition and medical trauma, while potentially influencing audience understanding of legitimate medical procedures through entertainment content that prioritizes disturbing imagery over accurate representation of therapeutic approaches and supportive medical care for individuals experiencing gender dysphoria and related psychological challenges. The post-surgical adjustment period reveals systematic psychological complications that accompany major identity transformation, while demonstrating how surgical intervention without appropriate psychological preparation, therapeutic support creates conditions where individuals experience continued identity, confusion, and emotional instability, despite physical changes that were intended to resolve psychological distress and enable authentic self-expression through alignment between internal identity and external physical characteristics. Stan Marsh's depression and alcoholism in You're Getting Old represent systematic documentation of childhood psychological breakdown while exploring how family dysfunction and environmental stress create conditions where developing individuals lose access to wonder, curiosity, and emotional engagement with previously meaningful activities and relationships through psychological adaptation mechanisms that protect against continued disappointment and trauma exposure by eliminating emotional investment and authentic engagement with social and cultural experiences. The literal feces perception that characterizes Stan's psychological state creates systematic transformation of previously enjoyable experiences into disgusting and meaningless activities, while demonstrating how depression alters sensory processing and cognitive interpretation of environmental stimuli through neurochemical changes that prevent access to positive emotional responses and satisfaction from activities that should provide pleasure and social connection during crucial developmental phases when identity formation requires positive engagement with cultural and social resources. The parental divorce that triggers Stan's psychological crisis reveals systematic family dysfunction while demonstrating how adult relationship failures create traumatic impact on children whose developmental stability depends upon predictable family structures and emotional security from parental relationships that should provide consistent support and protection rather than additional stress and uncertainty that exceeds childhood coping capacity and requires therapeutic intervention and family counseling to address underlying problems and restore healthy family functioning. The alcohol consumption that Stan employs as coping mechanism represents systematic self-medication through chemical intervention, while revealing how children develop substance dependency patterns in response to psychological distress and family trauma when appropriate therapeutic support remains unavailable or inadequate to address underlying emotional problems and family dysfunction that create conditions requiring professional intervention rather than individual adaptation through potentially harmful behavioral strategies. The human centipade's psychological horror elements create systematic documentation of technological exploitation and digital consent violation, while exploring how corporate entities manipulate legal frameworks and user agreements to create conditions where individuals become trapped in exploitative relationships that violate human dignity through technological systems that operate outside normal ethical and legal constraints governing human treatment and individual autonomy, rights that should protect against systematic abuse and exploitation through corporate manipulation of legal technicalities. The forced participation that Kyle experiences through manipulated consent creates systematic exploration of how technological dependency and digital connectivity create vulnerabilities that enable unprecedented forms of control and exploitation, while demonstrating how corporate interests prioritize profit generation over individual welfare and human dignity through system designs that eliminate user autonomy and create conditions where participation becomes compulsory rather than voluntary. Despite technical compliance with legal consent requirements that disguise coercive circumstances, the systematic dehumanization that characterizes the corporate experiment reveals institutional mechanisms that transform individuals into experimental subjects and commercial resources, while eliminating access to basic human dignity and legal protection through technological systems that operate according to terms of service agreements rather than normal human rights protections and ethical constraints governing treatment of individuals who deserve respect and consideration regardless of their participation in technological systems and digital platforms. Chef's brainwashing and ideological possession represents systematic documentation of how cult recruitment and psychological manipulation operate to destroy authentic personality and replace individual identity with ideological programming that serves organizational objectives rather than personal development and autonomous decision-making capabilities that enable healthy life choices and authentic relationship formation with individuals and communities that respect individual dignity and support personal growth rather than exploitation and control through psychological manipulation technique. The Super Adventure Club recruitment that transforms Chef's personality demonstrates systematic institutional manipulation through sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques that identify and exploit individual pace vulnerabilities while creating conditions where rational decision-making becomes impossible through ideological programming that eliminates critical thinking capabilities and independent moral reasoning that might enable recognition of manipulative circumstances and resistance to continued exploitation through organizational involvement and ideological compliance requirements. The gradual personality transformation that eliminates Chef's authentic identity reveals systematic progression through psychological control techniques that replace individual values and personal relationships with organizational loyalty and ideological commitment, while demonstrating how cult manipulation operates through incremental changes that prevent recognition of cumulative psychological impact until personality transformation reaches irreversible levels, where individual agency becomes subordinated to organizational control and ideological programming that eliminates access to authentic self-expression and autonomous decision-making. The violent death that provides climactic resolution to Chef's psychological possession creates systematic transformation of beloved character into source of trauma and psychological disturbance, while demonstrating how ideological manipulation ultimately destroys individuals who become consumed by organizational objectives and lose connection to authentic identity and personal relationships that might provide intervention and support during crucial phases when recovery remains possible through therapeutic intervention and community support networks. The ultimate horror of systematic psychological torture and mental breakdown lies not in any specific incident or individual case of personality destruction, but in the complete documentation of how various forms of psychological assault operate to eliminate authentic selfhood while creating fragmented consciousness that serves external manipulation rather than individual well-being through systematic exposure to chemical influence, ideological programming, technological exploitation, and environmental stresses that exceed human capacity for healthy adaptation, while creating conditions where mental stability becomes impossible to maintain without therapeutic intervention and supportive community resources that recognize individual dignity and prioritize psychological healing over institutional objectives and organizational control mechanisms that exploit vulnerability rather than providing genuine support for psychological recovery and authentic personal development. In the fundamental architecture of family systems where generational patterns of emotional dysfunction and psychological trauma become transmitted across bloodlines through parenting behaviors that reflect unresolved childhood wounds and developmental failures, South Park presents systematic documentation of how adult emotional immaturity and psychological instability create conditions where children must assume caretaking responsibilities for parents whose developmental arrested at earlier phases, while simultaneously experiencing systematic abuse and neglect that perpetuates cycles of harm across family generations through mechanisms so deeply embedded in personality, structure, and relationship patterns that they operate below conscious awareness, while creating inevitable repetition of traumatic dynamics. Despite conscious intentions to provide better parenting than previous generations, the Stotch family dysfunction represents perhaps the most comprehensive exploration of systematic child abuse, disguised as moral instruction, while revealing how parents whose own developmental needs remained unmet during childhood create elaborate psychological frameworks that justify inflicting emotional trauma upon their children through religious rhetoric and disciplinary structures that serve parental psychological needs for control and superiority, rather than genuine child welfare or moral development objectives that might actually benefit childhood development and character formation. Stephen and Linda Stotch demonstrate parental narcissism so profound and systematic that their son Butters exists primarily as repository for their unresolved emotional conflicts and psychological inadequacies rather than autonomous individual, deserving protection and nurturing support during crucial developmental phases. The elaborate punishment systems that characterize Butters' home environment operate according to principles designed to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about abusive intentions through appeals to parental authority and moral instruction that disguise sadistic gratification and power assertion as legitimate disciplinary measures necessary for character development and behavioral modification. The grounding punishments that isolate Butters from normal social interaction and peer relationships create systematic emotional deprivation while preventing development of external support networks that might provide alternative perspectives on family dynamics and emotional resources that could buffer against parental psychological abuse and manipulation techniques. The attempted murder incident, where Linda Stotch tries to drown her son while presenting the action as suicide murder, motivated by family shame, reveals abuse escalation patterns that demonstrate how parental psychological instability can progress toward life-threatening violence when internal emotional regulation systems fail, while external accountability mechanisms remain absent or ineffective for preventing dangerous behavior toward vulnerable family members who depend upon parental protection rather than systematic victimization through increasingly severe psychological and physical abuse that serves no legitimate disciplinary or educational purpose. The religious manipulation that Stephen employs to justify systematic psychological torture demonstrates how spiritual authority and moral rhetoric become weaponized to provide divine sanction for behavior that violates fundamental principles of love and compassion while creating additional layers of psychological damage through spiritual abuse that attacks the child's understanding of divine love and moral authority. The systematic perversion of religious concepts to justify cruelty creates spiritual trauma that complicates recovery and healing processes by contaminating faith communities and religious resources that might otherwise provide support and plague. Intervention during family crisis situation. The community's failure to recognize obvious signs of child abuse within the Stoch household reveals systematic social blindness and institutional inadequacy that enables continued family dysfunction, while demonstrating how middle-class respectability and social conformity can disguise systematic child maltreatment from neighbors and professional authorities who possess legal responsibility for child protection, but lack effective assessment and intervention capabilities for addressing psychological abuse that operates through subtle manipulation rather than obvious physical violence that would trigger mandatory reporting requirements. Kenny McCormick's family circumstances represent systematic documentation of intergenerational poverty and substance abuse, while exploring how economic desperation and addiction create family environments where children experience chronic neglect and exposure to dangerous circumstances that exceed their developmental capacity for healthy adaptation and autonomous protection from harm. Stuart and Carol McCormick demonstrate parental dysfunction that operates through chemical dependency and criminal behavior, while creating household conditions where children must assume adult responsibilities for family survival and emotional support without receiving appropriate guidance or protection from parents whose addiction and illegal activities prioritize substance acquisition over child welfare and family stability. The meth manufacturing operation that Kenny's parents conduct within their family home creates systematic exposure to toxic chemicals and criminal activity, while demonstrating how addiction-driven behavior eliminates normal parental judgment and protective instincts in favor of drug production and distribution activities that endanger children through environmental contamination and law enforcement risks that could result in family separation and criminal prosecution. The normalization of illegal drug activity within the household creates conditions where children develop distorted understanding of legal and social boundaries, while learning to accept dangerous circumstances as routine aspects of family life rather than crisis situations requiring immediate intervention and protective services. The reality television exploitation that transforms the McCormick family crisis into entertainment content demonstrates systematic commodification of poverty and family dysfunction, while revealing how media institutions profit from human suffering and child endangerment through programming that presents genuine family trauma as entertainment spectacle for audience consumption. The White Trash in Trouble television production creates additional layers of exploitation and humiliation while preventing authentic intervention and support services that might address underlying problems contributing to family dysfunction and child neglect within economic and social circumstances that require comprehensive community support rather than media exploitation. The foster care placement that results from parental arrest demonstrates additional institutional failure where protective services become sources of continued trauma and exploitation rather than genuine refuge and therapeutic intervention for children escaping dangerous family situations, indicating systematic dysfunction throughout child welfare systems that theoretically exist to protect vulnerable populations, but actually perpetuate cycles of institutional abuse and emotional damage through inadequate resources and professional incompetence that fails to address underlying trauma and developmental needs of children experiencing family crisis and separation. Randy Marsh's narcissistic destruction of his family's stability represents systematic documentation of how adult emotional immaturity and attention-seeking behavior create conditions where family welfare becomes subordinated to individual gratification and public recognition, while children experience continued instability and emotional neglect from parents whose psychological needs for validation and excitement exceed their capacity for consistent nurturing and protective behavior toward family members who depend upon parental reliability for developmental security and emotional support. The geological career instability that characterizes Randy's professional life creates ongoing financial insecurity and family stress, while demonstrating how adult impulse control problems and grandiose thinking patterns prevent steady employment and responsible family provision through erratic decision-making and project abandonment that prioritizes immediate gratification over long-term family welfare and stability needs. The recurring pattern of professional disasters and community endangerment that follows Randy's various schemes creates systematic trauma for family members who must cope with consequences of his irresponsible behavior while receiving no protection from ongoing stress and public humiliation. The marijuana farm venture that Randy pursues despite family objections demonstrates systematic prioritization of personal interests over family welfare while creating illegal activities and community conflict that endanger family relationships and social standing through behavior that serves individual psychological needs for excitement and validation rather than genuine consideration for family impact and community responsibility. The transformation of family agricultural resources into illegal drug production creates additional layers of legal risk and social problems, while forcing family members to participate in or enable criminal activity against their values and safety concerns. The social media attention-seeking that characterizes Randy's public behavior creates systematic family embarrassment and social isolation, while demonstrating how adult narcissistic needs for public recognition can override normal consideration for family privacy and social dignity through behavior that prioritizes viral fame and internet popularity over family welfare and community relationships. The recurring pattern of public humiliation and social conflict that results from Randy's attention-seeking behavior creates ongoing stress and emotional damage for family members who must cope with community judgment and peer relationships complicated by parental behavior that violates normal social boundaries. Mr. Garrison's relationship with his father represents systematic exploration of how childhood emotional neglect and parental unavailability create lasting psychological damage and identity confusion that influences adult relationship patterns and behavioral choices throughout the lifespan, while demonstrating how unresolved childhood trauma operates to distort understanding of love, attention, and appropriate boundaries within family and intimate relationships. The revelation that Garrison Sr.'s failure to abuse his son created feelings of rejection and inadequacy demonstrates how childhood developmental needs for attention and recognition can become distorted through neglect into pathological relationship patterns that seek negative attention as substitute for genuine care and emotional connection. The reversal of normal abuse narratives that characterizes Garrison's psychological complaints reveals how emotional neglect can create psychological damage comparable to active abuse, while demonstrating how children interpret parental indifference and emotional unavailability as evidence of personal inadequacy and lack of worth, rather than recognizing parental limitations and emotional dysfunction as factors independent of child behavior and inherent value. The pressure that Garrison places upon his father to provide retroactive abuse demonstrates how unresolved childhood trauma can create desperate attempts to obtain parental attention and validation through any available means, even when such attention involves harmful or inappropriate behavior. The intergenerational trauma patterns that emerge through multiple family systems within South Park's community reveal systematic documentation of how childhood developmental failures create adult relationship dysfunction that inevitably reproduces similar conditions for the next generation, while demonstrating how unresolved psychological wounds and emotional immaturity prevent parents from providing nurturing and protection that children require for healthy development and successful transition to autonomous adult functioning within supportive community relationships. The normalization of family dysfunction within South Park's community demonstrates collective adaptation to systematic child endangerment and parental inadequacy, while revealing how communities can develop cultural patterns that enable continued abuse and neglect through reduced expectations and resigned acceptance that family problems represent inevitable aspects of social organization rather than correctable dysfunction that could be addressed through appropriate intervention and support services for families experiencing crisis situations and developmental challenges. The therapeutic intervention absence that characterizes community response to obvious family dysfunction reveals systematic institutional failure to provide appropriate mental health services and family support resources that might interrupt cycles of intergenerational trauma, while enabling recovery and healthy relationship development through professional therapeutic intervention and community support networks that recognize family welfare as collective responsibility rather than private matter beyond community concern or intervention authority. The ultimate tragedy of parental failure and generational trauma lies not in any specific family situation or individual case of child abuse and neglect, but in the systematic documentation of how unresolved childhood wounds create adult psychological dysfunction that inevitably reproduces traumatic conditions for subsequent generations, while communities fail to provide intervention and support services that might interrupt cycles of harm through therapeutic resources and family support systems that prioritize child welfare over parental autonomy and family privacy, creating conditions where each generation must adapt to dysfunction rather than receiving healing and support that would enable authentic family love and healthy child development within communities that recognize collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable populations and ensuring that children receive nurturing and protection necessary for successful development into emotionally healthy adults, capable of forming loving families and supportive communities. In the systematic architecture of modern economic exploitation, where human suffering becomes transformed into profitable commodity through institutional mechanisms that identify vulnerability and desperation as market opportunities, South Park documents the horrifying process through which capitalist enterprise operates to convert individual pain into revenue streams, while revealing how business models emerge that depend upon the continued existence of human misery. and social dysfunction rather than their resolution, creating economic incentives that actively prevent healing and recovery in favor of sustained exploitation of populations whose circumstances generate profitable content and consumer demand through systematic commodification of populations, trauma, addiction, poverty, and death that serves commercial interests rather than human welfare or community development. The Athletic Babies episode represents systematic documentation of how addiction and developmental disability become exploited through entertainment ventures that transform human vulnerability into profitable spectacle, while demonstrating how individuals experiencing substance dependency and cognitive limitations become resources for commercial exploitation rather than recipients of therapeutic intervention and supportive services that might address underlying conditions and enable recovery and functional independence. Cartman's scheme to profit from steroid-enhanced infants reveals business thinking that identifies human suffering as renewable resource for generating entertainment content and competitive advantage through systematic abuse of individuals whose developmental circumstances prevent informed consent or protective advocacy against exploitation by commercial interests. The manipulation of babies through performance-enhancing substances creates systematic child abuse disguised as athletic training, while demonstrating how commercial interests can override basic ethical considerations and child protection standards when profit opportunities emerge that depend upon exploiting vulnerable populations who lack capacity for self-protection or autonomous decision-making regarding their participation in activities that serve commercial rather than developmental or therapeutic purposes. The systematic administration of dangerous substances to developing infants represents criminal child endangerment justified through appeals to competitive advantage and entertainment value that prioritizes commercial success over basic human welfare and medical safety requirements. Kyle's initial compassionate response to the advertising campaign that exposes infant exploitation demonstrates normal human empathy and moral reasoning that recognizes systematic abuse and seeks intervention to protect vulnerable populations from continued harm through appropriate authorities and support services that should address underlying problems rather than enabling continued exploitation. His subsequent participation in Cartman's scheme reveals how economic incentives and peer pressure can corrupt moral judgment while creating conditions where individuals abandon ethical principles in favor of financial opportunity that depends upon continued suffering of vulnerable populations, whose exploitation generates profit for participants who overcome initial moral objections through rationalization and social influence. The advertising techniques that present infant addiction and exploitation through emotionally manipulative imagery designed to generate sympathy and charitable donations demonstrate how commercial interests exploit authentic human compassion while redirecting charitable impulses toward profit generation rather than genuine relief and therapeutic intervention for populations experiencing crisis situations that require comprehensive support services and professional intervention, rather than entertainment consumption and commercial exploitation disguised as charitable assistance or awareness campaigns. Kenny's parents' reality television participation represents systematic commodification of family dysfunction and criminal behavior, while demonstrating how media institutions identify poverty and addiction as content opportunities that generate audience, engagement, and advertising revenue through presentation of genuine human suffering as entertainment spectacle for viewers whose consumption of such programming enables continued exploitation while providing psychological distance from direct participation in systematic abuse of vulnerable populations whose personal tragedies become profitable content. The White Trash in Trouble television production creates systematic exploitation of family crisis and child endangerment, while revealing how media companies develop programming strategies that depend upon identifying families experiencing addiction, poverty, and criminal behavior whose circumstances provide dramatic content and audience appeal through voyeuristic consumption of others' suffering and degradation. The transformation of genuine family trauma into entertainment commodity demonstrates how television production operates to profit from human misery while preventing authentic intervention and support services that might resolve underlying problems and eliminate content generation opportunities. The foster care system placement that results from media-documented family crisis creates additional layers of institutional exploitation while demonstrating how child welfare systems can become extensions of entertainment production that prioritize content generation over genuine child protection and family preservation through therapeutic intervention and support services. The systematic failure to provide appropriate therapeutic resources while maintaining television documentation reveals institutional priorities that serve media interests rather than child welfare objectives that should focus on healing and family reunification when possible through comprehensive support services and professional intervention. The stem cell pizza scheme that exploits Kenny's terminal illness represents perhaps the most systematic example of how commercial interests identify human suffering as business opportunity, while demonstrating how death and medical crisis become resources for profit generation through elaborate deception and policy manipulation that serves commercial objectives rather than genuine medical research or therapeutic intervention for individuals and families experiencing health emergencies and terminal diagnosis circumstances. The congressional advocacy that Cartman orchestrates while Kenny experiences terminal illness demonstrates sophisticated understanding of political processes and public relations strategies that enable manipulation of governmental policy through appeals to humanitarian concerns and medical research advancement while concealing actual commercial objectives that depend upon legislative changes for profit generation, rather than genuine concern for medical advancement or patient welfare. The systematic deception involved in presenting commercial interests as humanitarian advocacy reveals how political systems become vulnerable to manipulation by individuals whose business models depend upon policy changes that enable exploitation of vulnerable populations. The fetal tissue collection that becomes legalized through Cartman's advocacy efforts creates systematic commodification of human biological material, while demonstrating how medical research frameworks can become exploited for commercial purposes that bear no relationship to legitimate or scientific advancement or therapeutic development. The transformation of stem cell research legislation into opportunity for restaurant supply chain development reveals how legitimate medical and scientific objectives become corrupted through commercial manipulation of regulatory systems and public policy processes. The pizza restaurant business model that depends upon fetal tissue as ingredient demonstrates commercial thinking so fundamentally disturbed and morally bankrupt that it challenges assumptions about the capacity for ethical constraint within entrepreneurial activity, while revealing how business opportunities can emerge that depend upon systematic violation of human dignity and cultural taboos regarding appropriate treatment of human biological material and death circumstances. The casual presentation of cannibalism as restaurant innovation indicates psychological detachment from normal human moral boundaries while prioritizing profit generation over basic ethical considerations that should constrain commercial activity. The systematic concealment of ingredient sources from restaurant customers creates additional layers of exploitation through consumer deception, while demonstrating how commercial fraud operates to enable continued business activity that would be impossible if customers possessed accurate information about product contents and business practices. The success of the deceptive business model reveals how consumer trust and regulatory oversight can be exploited to enable commercial activity that violates fundamental ethical boundaries while generating profit through systematic misrepresentation and concealment of morally objectionable practices. The medical crisis exploitation that characterizes the entire stem cell pizza scheme demonstrates how terminal illness and family grief become identified as commercial opportunities by individuals whose business thinking operates without ethical constraint, while prioritizing profit generation over human dignity and appropriate support for families experiencing medical emergencies and death circumstances that require compassionate care and genuine therapeutic resources, rather than commercial exploitation disguised as humanitarian advocacy and medical research advancement. The reality television contracts that bind families experiencing crisis situations into long-term media exploitation create systematic prevention of authentic recovery and healing through commercial agreements that require continued dysfunction and crisis circumstances for content generation purposes, indicating how media contracts can become tools for perpetuating human suffering while preventing therapeutic intervention and family stability that might eliminate entertainment value and commercial viability of ongoing documentation and prison. Public presentation of family trauma. The audience consumption patterns that enable continued production of exploitation-based entertainment reveal collective participation in systematic human degradation, while demonstrating how viewers become complicit in commercial abuse of vulnerable populations through continued consumption of programming that depends upon real human suffering for entertainment value and advertising revenue generation. The psychological distance that television provides enables moral detachment from direct participation while maintaining commercial support for institutional systems that profit from systematic exploitation of poverty, addiction, and family dysfunction. The governmental policy manipulation that enables various exploitation schemes demonstrates how legislative and regulatory systems become vulnerable to influence by commercial interests that identify policy changes as opportunities for profit generation through systematic abuse of vulnerable populations whose protection should represent primary governmental responsibility rather than obstacle to commercial innovation and business development. The systematic corruption of humanitarian advocacy and medical research policy for commercial purposes reveals how legitimate governmental functions can become exploited by individuals whose business models depend upon regulatory changes that enable continued exploitation while preventing appropriate protection and intervention for vulnerable populations. The institutional failure that enables continued commercial exploitation of human suffering reveals systematic absence of oversight and accountability mechanisms that should prevent business models dependent upon systematic abuse and continued existence of social problems that generate profit opportunities rather than requiring resolution through therapeutic intervention and support services. The persistence of exploitation-based commerce indicates regulatory and enforcement systems that prioritize commercial activity over human welfare, while failing to recognize or appropriately address business practices that depend upon systematic perpetuation of human misery for profit generation. The ultimate horror of systematic commodification of human suffering lies not in any specific business scheme or commercial exploitation, but in the complete transformation of human pain into renewable resource for profit generation while creating economic systems that actively prevent healing and recovery in favor of sustained exploitation through business models that identify vulnerability as market opportunity rather than recognizing human dignity and welfare as values that constrain commercial activity and require genuine therapeutic intervention and community support for populations experiencing crisis circumstances that deserve compassionate care rather than systematic commercial exploitation disguised as entertainment content and business innovation that serves profit generation rather than human welfare and community development. In the fundamental architecture of moral reasoning, where ethical behavior should generate positive consequences and virtuous actions should receive appropriate recognition and reward through social and cosmic justice mechanisms that reinforce moral behavior while discouraging harmful conduct, South Park presents systematic documentation of a universe operating according to principles so fundamentally inverted and morally bankrupt that good intentions consistently produce devastating outcomes while evil behavior receives reward and protection through institutional mechanisms that punish virtue while enabling continued harm by individuals whose actions should face immediate consequences and appropriate accountability for their systematic violation of ethical boundaries and human dignity. Cartman's future erasure, despite genuine redemption, represents perhaps the most systematic exploration of cosmic injustice, while demonstrating how moral transformation and authentic spiritual development can be rendered meaningless through temporal manipulation and reality revision that eliminates positive change and personal growth achievements that required extraordinary effort and genuine commitment to ethical principles and community service. The timeline alteration that removes Cartman's wife and children from existence while restoring his pattern of antisocial behavior demonstrates universe operating according to principles that actively punish moral development while preserving dysfunction and harmful behavior patterns that serve no constructive purpose beyond maintaining consistency with previous character development, regardless of authentic change and spiritual growth. The sacrificial nature of Cartman's decision to allow timeline alteration, despite knowing the personal consequences, reveals genuine moral development and selfless concern for community welfare that exceeds any previous demonstration of ethical reasoning and compassionate behavior throughout his documented psychological development, indicating authentic transformation from sociopathic manipulation to genuine moral agency and ethical decision-making capability that should receive recognition and protection rather than systematic elimination through cosmic forces that operate without regard for individual moral achievement or community benefit. The cruel irony that Cartman's moral development occurs within timeline destined for elimination creates systematic exploration of meaningless sacrifice while demonstrating how ethical behavior can become completely divorced from positive consequences through circumstances that render virtue, pointless, and moral effort wasted despite authentic commitment to principles that should generate beneficial outcomes for individuals and communities that invest energy and resources in ethical development and spiritual growth. The universe's apparent indifference to genuine moral transformation indicates cosmic principles that operate independently of human ethical categories, while treating moral development as an irrelevant factor in determining individual, fate, and community outcomes. The restoration of Cartman's antisocial behavior pattern through timeline correction demonstrates systematic preference for consistency over growth, while revealing cosmic mechanisms that prioritize narrative continuity and character stability over genuine human development and moral transformation that might disrupt established patterns and create unpredictable outcomes requiring adjustment of social and institutional systems designed to accommodate fixed personality characteristics rather than dynamic moral development and spiritual evolution. The Indiana Jones assault allegory represents systematic violation of creative integrity and artistic legacy through corporate decision-making that transforms beloved cultural symbols into vehicles for commercial exploitation, regardless of damage to artistic vision and cultural meaning. That such characters provide for audiences whose emotional investment and cultural attachment receive no consideration within corporate systems that prioritize profit generation over cultural preservation and artistic responsibility. The graphic presentation of creative violation through sexual assault imagery creates disturbing associations between corporate media production and systematic abuse, while demonstrating how artistic creation can become corrupted through commercial interests that operate without regard for creator, intention, or audience welfare. The repeated violation sequences that characterize the episode's exploration of franchise destruction demonstrate systematic escalation of creative abuse, while revealing how corporate entertainment systems can identify successful cultural properties as resources for continued exploitation, rather than artistic achievements deserving protection and respectful treatment through production processes that honor original creative vision and cultural significance. The collaboration between creator figures in systematic destruction of their own artistic legacy reveals how commercial pressures and financial incentives can corrupt artistic integrity while forcing participation in activities that violate creative principles and cultural responsibility. The audience complicity that enables continued creative violation through consumption of degraded franchise content demonstrates collective participation in artistic destruction, while revealing how consumer demand and market pressures create economic incentives for continued production of entertainment content that violates original artistic vision and cultural meaning through systematic exploitation of established characters and narrative frameworks for commercial purposes that serve profit generation rather than artistic expression or cultural preservation. The Spider-Man Mysterious Ways explanation that Randy provides following Larry's accidental death represents systematic rationalization of random tragedy through appeal to supernatural purpose and divine plan that cannot be questioned or understood through human reasoning, creating theological framework that justifies arbitrary suffering while preventing appropriate accountability for human actions and institutional failures that contribute to preventable death and community tragedy. The invocation of superhero mythology to explain personal responsibility evasion demonstrates how cultural symbols can become corrupted through inappropriate application to circumstances that require honest assessment and appropriate accountability rather than mystical explanation and divine purpose attribution. The water main destruction that causes Larry's drowning results from Randy's interference, motivated by parental anxiety and possessive behavior rather than legitimate safety concerns or appropriate protective intervention, indicating how adult emotional dysfunction and poor decision-making can generate tragic consequences for innocent individuals, whose participation in normal social activities becomes dangerous through circumstances beyond their control or reasonable anticipation. The theater flooding that creates fatal circumstances demonstrates how individual irresponsible behavior can escalate through environmental factors to create community-wide disaster with innocent casualties. The life preserver irony that characterizes Larry's death reveals cosmic principles operating through systematic cruel humor, while demonstrating how safety measures and protective equipment become meaningless through circumstances that exceed their design parameters and intended protective function. The fire chief's comment about life preserver absence creates additional layers of tragic irony, while suggesting that individual preparedness and safety consciousness cannot protect against disasters created through institutional failure and environmental circumstances beyond personal control or reasonable anticipation. The family grief and guilt that follow Larry's death create lasting psychological damage for survivors, whose emotional investment and personal relationships become sources of ongoing pain through association with tragic circumstances and preventable loss, indicating how random tragedy generates intergenerational trauma and relationship dysfunction that extend far beyond immediate loss to encompass ongoing psychological consequences for individuals whose normal social and romantic development becomes contaminated through association with death, circumstances, and survivor guilt. The Man-Bear-Pig killing spree represents environmental apocalypse made manifest through systematic violence that demonstrates how ignored warnings and collective inaction regarding climate change create conditions where theoretical future consequences become immediate present reality, requiring emergency response and resource mobilization that society remains unprepared to provide, despite decades of scientific warning and policy discussion that failed to generate appropriate preventive action and institutional preparation. The initial dismissal of Man-Bear-Pig as Al Gore's delusion, followed by acknowledgement of reality, creates systematic exploration of how scientific warning and environmental advocacy become marginalized through political processes and cultural skepticism that prevent appropriate response to developing crises until damage reaches irreversible levels requiring emergency intervention and massive resource expenditure that could have been prevented through earlier recognition and appropriate policy response to legitimate scientific concern and environmental monitoring data. The gaming preference that supersedes emergency response during Man-Bear-Pig crisis demonstrates cultural priority systems that emphasize individual entertainment over collective survival, while revealing how modern society continues routine pleasure-seeking activities despite awareness of existential threats requiring immediate action and resource allocation for community protection and crisis response. The Red Dead Redemption 2 consumption during environmental apocalypse indicates psychological adaptation mechanisms that enable continued normal behavior through denial and distraction rather than appropriate crisis response and emergency mobilization. The intergenerational burden transfer that characterizes adult response to environmental crisis creates systematic exploitation of childhood responsibility, while enabling current adults to avoid accountability for creating circumstances requiring immediate intervention through policy changes and lifestyle modifications that remain politically and economically inconvenient. Despite scientific evidence indicating urgent need for comprehensive, social, and economic transformation to address environmental degradation and climate change consequences, the deal-making with Man-Bear-Pig that enables temporary crisis resolution demonstrates how environmental problems become managed through negotiation and compromise, rather than genuine solution and systematic prevention, creating conditions where future generations inherit ongoing environmental threats and degraded natural resources through adult failure to address underlying causes and implement comprehensive solutions that might prevent continued crisis, escalation, and environmental destruction. The pattern of moral punishment that characterizes numerous South Park episodes reveals universe operating according to principles that systematically penalize virtue while rewarding vice through circumstances that exceed random chance to encompass deliberate cosmic cruelty and moral inversion that treats ethical behavior as liability and antisocial conduct as advantage within social and institutional systems designed to enable exploitation and prevent accountability for harmful behavior patterns and institutional dysfunction. The recurring theme of good intentions producing harmful outcomes demonstrates systematic disconnection between ethical motivation and practical results, while revealing how moral reasoning and compassionate behavior can become corrupted through institutional mediation and social complexity that transforms virtuous action into sources of additional suffering and community dysfunction, despite authentic commitment to ethical principles and human welfare objectives. The absence of cosmic justice and moral accountability throughout South Park's documented history reveals universe operating according to principles that remain indifferent to human ethical categories, while treating moral development and spiritual growth as irrelevant factors in determining individual fate and community outcomes. Through cosmic forces that operate independently of human moral reasoning and ethical commitment, despite genuine effort to achieve virtue and contribute to community welfare and social justice. The systematic failure of virtue to generate positive consequences creates existential framework that challenges fundamental assumptions about moral agency and ethical responsibility, while suggesting that human moral effort operates within cosmic context that renders such effort meaningless through circumstances beyond individual control or community influence, indicating universe that operates according to principles fundamentally incompatible with human moral categories and ethical expectations regarding justice and appropriate consequences for individual behavior and institutional performance. The ultimate horror of moral relativism and the absence of justice lies not in any specific incident or individual case of cosmic unfairness, but in the systematic revelation of universe operating according to principles that render human moral effort meaningless, while creating conditions where virtue becomes liability and ethical behavior produces negative consequences through cosmic mechanisms that punish goodness while rewarding evil, through circumstances that exceed random chance to encompass deliberate moral inversion and systematic cosmic cruelty that challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between ethical behavior and appropriate consequences within universe that remains fundamentally hostile to human moral development and spiritual growth, despite authentic commitment to virtue and community welfare that deserves recognition and appropriate reward, rather than systematic punishment and cosmic indifference. In the psychological landscape of trauma recovery, where human beings should possess inherent capacity for healing and resilience that enables gradual restoration of emotional stability and functional behavior patterns through therapeutic intervention and supportive community relationships, South Park presents systematic documentation of how traumatic experiences create permanent psychological alterations that resist all attempts at recovery, while establishing behavioral patterns and emotional responses that remain fixed throughout the lifespan, regardless of therapeutic intervention or environmental improvement, suggesting fundamental incompatibility between human psychological architecture and the demands of contemporary existence within social systems that consistently generate trauma while providing inadequate resources for healing and recovery from experiences that exceed individual capacity for healthy integration and adaptive response. The cyclical nature of violence and abuse that characterizes South Park's documented history reveals patterns so deeply embedded within community structure and individual psychological development that they transcend personal choice, or conscious decision-making to encompass inherited behavioral templates and environmental conditions that reproduce traumatic circumstances across generational boundaries through mechanisms that operate below conscious awareness, while creating inevitable repetition of harmful dynamics. Despite individual intentions to break cycles of dysfunction and create healthier relationships and community conditions, the systematic transmission of trauma through family systems and social institutions creates conditions where each generation inherits psychological wounds and behavioral patterns that predispose them toward recreating similar circumstances for subsequent generations through unconscious replication of familiar relationship dynamics and problem-solving strategies that reflect past trauma rather than present circumstances or conscious values. Stan Marsh's gradual loss of childhood wonder and hopeful engagement with previously meaningful activities and relationships demonstrates systematic psychological deterioration that begins during elementary school years while progressively eliminating capacity for joy, curiosity, and authentic emotional connection with social and cultural resources that should provide ongoing satisfaction and developmental support throughout the lifespan. The transformation of previously enjoyable experiences into sources of disgust and meaninglessness reveals psychological adaptation mechanisms that protect against continued disappointment and emotional vulnerability through systematic withdrawal from investment in activities and relationships that might generate additional trauma or emotional pain through unpredictable circumstances and social dysfunction. The depression and cynicism that increasingly characterize Stan's worldview indicate psychological defense systems that sacrifice authentic engagement and emotional fulfillment in favor of protective detachment that prevents additional trauma, while simultaneously eliminating access to positive experiences and supportive relationships that might provide healing resources and recovery opportunities. The systematic desensitization to beauty and meaning that accompanies Stan's psychological development creates conditions where therapeutic intervention becomes increasingly difficult, while recovery requires overcoming deeply established patterns of emotional withdrawal and cognitive interpretation that filter all experiences through frameworks of disappointment and futility. The alcohol consumption that Stan employs as coping mechanism during family crisis demonstrates how traumatic stress drives individuals toward chemical intervention and self-medication strategies that provide temporary relief from psychological pain while creating additional problems, and dependency patterns that complicate recovery and prevent development of healthy stress management and emotional regulation capabilities. The normalization of substance use as response to family dysfunction indicates environmental conditions where appropriate therapeutic resources and family support systems remain unavailable, while individuals must develop autonomous coping strategies that often prove counterproductive for long-term psychological health and social functioning. The family dysfunction that creates ongoing stress and emotional instability within Stan's developmental environment demonstrates how parental psychological problems and relationship conflicts generate cascading effects that influence childhood development and identity formation through exposure to adult emotional dysfunction and conflict patterns that exceed childhood capacity for healthy processing and adaptive response. The systematic exposure to parental inadequacy and family instability creates psychological foundations that assume dysfunction as normal baseline condition, while preventing development of realistic expectations regarding healthy relationships and functional family systems. The community violence and institutional failure that characterize Stan's educational and social environment create additional layers of trauma exposure, while demonstrating how environmental conditions can overwhelm individual resilience and adaptation capacity through systematic exposure to circumstances that exceed normal developmental challenges and require extraordinary psychological resources for healthy management and recovery. The accumulation of traumatic experiences across multiple life domains creates psychological burden that exceeds individual capacity for processing and integration, while preventing access to recovery periods and supportive resources that might enable healing and restoration of functional behavior patterns. Butterscotch's remarkable psychological resilience in maintaining kindness and optimism, despite systematic family abuse, represents either supernatural protection or extraordinary psychological strength that enables continued functioning under circumstances that would destroy most individuals' capacity for trust and emotional engagement with others. Yet even his apparent adaptation to abused circumstances creates lasting psychological alterations that influence his understanding of relationships and appropriate treatment, while potentially setting him up for continued victimization through learned patterns of accepting inappropriate behavior from authority figures and romantic partners. The internalized abuse messages and normalized dysfunction that result from prolonged exposure to systematic psychological manipulation create internal dialogue systems and behavioral expectations that reflect abusive relationship patterns rather than healthy interpersonal dynamics, indicating how childhood trauma becomes integrated into personality structure and relationship templates that guide adult behavior and partner selection through unconscious replication of familiar dynamics despite conscious intentions to create healthier relationships and avoid repeating family patterns of abuse and emotional dysfunction. The hypervigilance and emotional numbing that characterize trauma responses among South Park's population create psychological adaptations that enable functional behavior during crisis situations, while preventing normal emotional processing and authentic relationship formation through defensive mechanisms that assume danger as baseline condition, requiring constant threat assessment and protective positioning. These survival-oriented psychological adaptations serve protective functions during ongoing trauma exposure, while becoming counterproductive in safer environments where trust and vulnerability enable deeper connection and mutual support between individuals who deserve authentic emotional investment rather than defensive caution and strategic relationship management. The Kenny McCormick death and resurrection cycle represents systematic exposure to mortality and loss that should generate appropriate grief, processing, and memorial recognition, yet becomes normalized through repetitive occurrence that prevents healthy mourning and emotional integration of death experiences, while creating psychological adaptation mechanisms that treat human mortality as routine inconvenience rather than significant life event, requiring communal support and therapeutic processing. The systematic erasure of death impact from community memory indicates trauma responses that prioritize functional continuity over emotional healing, while preventing accumulation of grief and loss that might overwhelm community. Psychological capacity for continued operation. The recurring traumatic events that punctuate South Park's community life create ongoing stress and psychological burden that prevent recovery periods and healing processes, while requiring constant adaptation to new crisis situations and emergency circumstances that exceed normal community resources and individual coping capacity. The systematic exposure to supernatural phenomena, institutional failure, and social violence creates psychological environment where trauma becomes normalized as inevitable aspect of community life, rather than extraordinary circumstance requiring appropriate intervention and recovery support through therapeutic resources and community healing processes. The therapeutic intervention, absence that characterizes community response to obvious trauma and psychological damage, reveals systematic institutional failure to provide appropriate mental health services and recovery resources, while enabling continued dysfunction and psychological damage through neglect of basic psychological needs and healing requirements that should receive priority within community resource allocation and service provision systems. The normalization of psychological damage and behavioral dysfunction indicates community adaptation mechanisms that accept trauma as inevitable, while failing to provide recovery resources that might interrupt cycles of harm and enable genuine healing and psychological restoration. The intergenerational transmission of trauma through family systems and community dynamics creates psychological inheritance patterns where each generation receives damaged emotional templates and behavioral patterns while contributing additional trauma and dysfunction to legacy systems that become increasingly resistant to intervention and healing efforts, as accumulated damage exceeds community capacity for recovery and restoration through available therapeutic resources and social support mechanisms. The social isolation and relationship dysfunction that result from systematic trauma exposure prevent formation of supportive community networks and healing relationships, while creating conditions where individuals must manage psychological damage through autonomous strategies that often prove inadequate for addressing complex trauma and emotional dysfunction, requiring professional intervention and community support for effective healing and recovery processes that enable restoration of functional behavior patterns and healthy relationship formation. The existential despair and meaning-making difficulties that emerge from prolonged trauma exposure create philosophical and spiritual challenges that exceed individual capacity for resolution while requiring community wisdom, traditions, and spiritual resources that may themselves become contaminated through exposure to systematic dysfunction and institutional failure that undermines traditional sources of meaning and moral guidance within community systems that should provide stability and interpretive frameworks for managing difficult experiences and maintaining hope despite ongoing challenges and adversity. The ultimate horror of inescapable trauma lies not in any specific traumatic event or individual case of psychological damage, but in the systematic documentation of how traumatic experiences create permanent alterations in human psychological functioning that resist all attempts at recovery, while establishing patterns of emotional withdrawal and defensive adaptation that prevent access to healing resources and supportive relationships, creating conditions where trauma becomes self-perpetuating through psychological mechanisms that prioritize survival over healing, while ensuring that each generation inherits damaged templates for relationship, formation, and community participation that reproduce traumatic conditions despite conscious intentions to create healthier circumstances and break cycles of dysfunction through individual effort and community commitment to healing and recovery that remains insufficient for addressing accumulated damage and systemic dysfunction that exceeds available therapeutic resources and community capacity for genuine restoration and psychological healing. As we emerge from this catalogue of disturbances, perhaps the most unsettling realization is not that South Park created these horrors from imagination, but that it held up an unflinching mirror to the genuine darkness that permeates our actual world. Every shocking moment, every crossed line, every violated boundary reflects something uncomfortably real about human nature and social failure. The show's genius lies not in its capacity to shock, but in its ability to make us laugh at truths too painful to confront directly. In our laughter, we find both catharsis and complicity. As sleep takes hold, remember that South Park's disturbing moments serve as warnings disguised as entertainment, showing us what we become when compassion fails and institutions crumble. The real horror isn't that these things happen in an animated mountain town, but that they echo in our own communities, our own relationships, our own hearts. Rest now, knowing that recognition is the first step toward change, and that sometimes the darkest stories illuminate the path toward light.